In 1819, a fair-haired teenage girl became ruler of the most powerful empire on Earth. By the time she died, 1 in 4 humans lived under her rule. Her family controlled most of Europe's thrones, and the world had been completely transformed. Here's what life was really like during the Victorian era. So yeah, if these stories help you sleep, subscribe. And I'm curious, what time is it where you are? Comment your location and time. I saw someone from Tokyo last week saying it was already tomorrow there. Still trying to wrap my head around that. Okay, tonight it's the Victorian era. But wait, are you comfortable? No, really. Check. Pillows, blankets, the whole deal. Where we're going, you'll want to be settled. Your eyes flutter open to darkness. The heavy damask curtains around your bed block out almost all light. For a moment, you're disoriented. Is it morning already? You can hear the faint sounds of servants moving somewhere in the massive palace, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. The air is cold against your face, but beneath the layers of blankets, you're warm enough. This is Kensington Palace, and the year is 1819. You're not Queen Victoria, not yet. Right now, you're just a little princess named Alexandrina Victoria, though everyone calls you Drina, and your life, frankly, sucks. I mean, sure, you live in a palace, but it's a damp, drafty old place that smells of mildew and coal smoke. Your bedroom isn't even your own. Your mother makes you sleep in her room, in a little bed next to hers. You're not allowed to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. At 5 years old, that might make sense, but this rule will continue until you're literally an adult. "Good morning, princess," says your German governess, Baroness Letzen, the only person who seems to genuinely care about you. Your mother is still asleep, her loud German snoring filling the room. Unlike your comfy, temperature-controlled bedroom back in the real world, this royal bedroom is bizarrely uncomfortable. The fireplace has gone out overnight, and you can see your breath in the cold morning air. Your mother doesn't believe in heating rooms too much. She thinks it's unhealthy. The windows, sealed against the London fog, trap the smells of the previous day inside. Notes of perfume, body odour, because even royals didn't bathe daily. Coal smoke and the lingering scent of last night's dinner create a distinct aroma that modern noses would find overwhelming. Your feet hit the cold floor, and you wince. Even princesses don't have heated bathroom tiles in 1820. Actually, you don't have a bathroom at all. Instead, there's a ceramic chamber pot behind a screen in the corner of the room, which some poor servant will have to empty later. When you need a bath, which is only about once a week, servants will carry buckets of heated water up several flights of stairs to fill a portable metal tub. "Your lessons begin in 1 hour, princess," the Baroness reminds you. And oh God, the lessons. You're going to spend almost every waking hour studying languages, history, mathematics, religion, music, art, a relentless schedule designed by your mother and her trusted advisor, Sir John Conroy. They call it the Kensington system, but it's basically royal child prison. "Mother says I must practice my piano for 2 hours today," you say, your voice small. "And your Latin," adds the Baroness, "and your German, French and Italian." This wasn't just some weird royal quirk. Victoria actually learned to speak 5 languages: English, French, German, Italian and Latin. I spent 3 years trying to learn Spanish on a language app and still can't order a taco properly. Here's the thing about Victoria's childhood that most people don't realise. It was incredibly lonely. She had almost no friends her own age. She wasn't allowed to play with other children except her half-sister Theodora, who was much older. Her only real companion was her spaniel, Dash. "Can I play with Dash in the gardens today?" you ask hopefully. The Baroness smiles sadly. "Perhaps for a short while, if Sir John approves the weather is suitable." That's another fun thing about being Princess Victoria. You're never allowed outside alone. Every breath of fresh air must be approved and supervised. Your mother and Conroy are terrified you might catch a cold and die before becoming queen, or worse, that someone might kidnap you or influence you to think for yourself. You see, there's something you don't know yet, but the adults around you are very aware of. You're much closer to the throne than anyone expected. Your father, Edward, Duke of Kent, was only the fourth son of King George III, but a weird series of royal deaths and a shocking lack of legitimate children has pushed you up the line of succession. Sir John says I must practice my posture today. You sigh, straightening your back automatically. Conroy, a former military officer with no actual education experience, has appointed himself in charge of making you a proper queen. Mostly this involves making you miserable. Let me paint you a picture of Sir John Conroy, because this dude was the absolute worst. Imagine a tall, imposing man with perfect posture and cold, calculating eyes. He's handsome in that stern Victorian way, always dressed impeccably, with mutton chop sideburns and an air of absolute authority. Behind closed doors, historians suspect he was having an affair with Victoria's mother. Whatever the relationship, they were definitely in cahoots to control the future queen. The childhood home of one of history's most powerful monarchs wasn't the fairy tale you might imagine. Kensington Palace in the 1820s was actually kind of a dump by royal standards. It was drafty, with peeling wallpaper and furniture that had seen better days. King George IV, Victoria's uncle, deliberately kept it that way because he disliked her mother. Victoria later wrote that the palace had gloomy rooms with their old-fashioned furniture and small dark passages. The walls of Kensington were literally closing in on young Victoria. Her entire world consisted of a few rooms where she was constantly watched. Even her dolls were educational tools. She had to sew their clothes herself as part of her domestic training. She wasn't allowed to read novels or attend the theatre. Her meals were plain and strictly scheduled. Every minute of her day was planned by others. Time for breakfast, the Baroness says, helping you dress in a simple white cotton dress with a pinafore. No fancy princess gowns for daily wear. Victoria's mother insisted on simple, practical clothing. Breakfast in the royal household is disappointingly basic. A small portion of porridge, some bread with butter, and weak tea with milk. Victoria's mother believed in a simple diet for children. No sugary cereals or chocolate-filled croissants here. The bread is dense and chewy, nothing like the soft sandwich bread you're used to. I've had a letter from your cousin, Princess Sophia, the Baroness mentions as you eat. She sends her regards. Cousins. You have so many cousins, all part of the vast network of European royalty. Most of them you've never met. Your mother keeps you isolated from the court, from your father's family, from anyone who might challenge her control. It's all part of the plan. Keep you dependent on her and Conroy, so when you become queen, they'll be the ones actually ruling. Hold up. Let me paint you a picture of European royalty at this time. Imagine the most dramatic, backstabbing, incestuous family reunion possible, but everyone's wearing crowns. Victoria's grandfather, George III, yes, the one who lost America, had 15 children. These royal kids and their offspring were married into every major European royal house, creating a tangled web of cousins ruling different countries. Victoria herself would later marry her first cousin, Albert. This wasn't considered weird, it was strategic family business. The king is very ill, you overhear your mother whispering to Conroy later that morning. William may not last the year. King William IV, your uncle, the current King of England. If he dies, you're next. You're 17 now, almost 18. If the king dies after your 18th birthday, you can rule alone. If he dies before, your mother becomes regent, ruling in your name. This is the countdown that dominates your adolescence. Your mother and Conroy desperately want the king to die before your birthday. You desperately need him to hang on just a little longer. I must speak with the princess about her duties, Conroy announces, striding into the room without knocking. She must sign the papers. The papers. God, the papers. Conroy has been pushing you for months to sign documents that would make him your private secretary and your mother your regent. Even if you're already 18 when you become queen, you've refused every time, even during that horrible incident at Ramsgate. I need to tell you about the Ramsgate incident because it shows just how strong Victoria really was. When Victoria was 16, she got extremely sick while staying at a seaside town called Ramsgate. We're talking high fever, delirium, the works. Conroy saw his opportunity and tried to force her to sign papers making him her private secretary. Even delirious with fever, she refused. This teenage girl, who'd been controlled and manipulated her entire life, somehow found the strength to stand up to her abusers when it mattered most. "I will not sign," you say firmly, your voice stronger than you feel. Conroy's face darkens with anger. "You are an ignorant, foolish child. You need guidance. You need me." "I need only what the law provides," you counter. "You've studied constitutional law. You know your rights as the future monarch." This showdown between Victoria and Conroy happened repeatedly in the year before she became queen. Despite being raised to be compliant and dependent, Victoria somehow developed an extraordinary iron will. She understood power and was determined to claim hers when the time came. May 24th, 1837, your 18th birthday. You're officially an adult. The king still lives, though reports say he's failing fast. Your mother gives you a journal as a birthday present, leather-bound with a lock and key. This will become your refuge, the one place you can speak freely. Victoria would end up writing over 60 million words in her diaries throughout her life. That's more than 120 books worth of material. "I shall be glad to have my liberty at last," you write in your new journal that night, and then, less than a month later, it happens. June 20th, 1837, dawn is just breaking over Kensington Palace. You're asleep in your little bed in your mother's room, the same bed you've slept in since childhood. There's an urgent knocking at the door. "The princess must come down immediately," a voice calls. You're awakened, confused. The Baroness helps you put on a robe over your nightgown. Your hair is loose around your shoulders. No time to dress properly. "You must go alone," the Baroness whispers, breaking protocol for the first time in your memory. You descend the stairs without anyone holding your hand. In the drawing room below, you find the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain waiting, both looking solemn in formal black clothes. "Your Majesty," they say, bowing deeply. And just like that, everything changes. King William IV died at 2:12 that morning. You are now Queen Victoria, ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, future Empress of India, head of the most powerful nation on earth. You're 18 years old. "I will be good," you say quietly. It's not a promise to the men before you, but to yourself. After a childhood of being controlled, you've just become one of the most powerful people in the world. I want you to try to wrap your head around what happened next because it's kind of mind-blowing. This sheltered teenager who had never been allowed to walk downstairs alone was suddenly in charge of a global superpower. Victoria had never shopped in a store, cooked a meal, or even been alone in a room with a man who wasn't a servant or relative. Now she was making decisions affecting millions of lives. Within hours, your entire life transforms. You're moved to Buckingham Palace. For the first time in your memory, you have your own bedroom. You banish Conroy from your presence. You keep your mother at a careful distance, giving her rooms far from your own. You summon the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, who will become your trusted advisor and friend. The contrast between your old life and new couldn't be more stark. Yesterday, you needed permission to walk in the garden. Today, armies march at your command. The Queen would like her breakfast served in her study, you inform a startled servant, and she would like to review the state papers there as well. You're setting the schedule now, making your own decisions, eating what you want, when you want, sleeping in your own room. But becoming queen doesn't solve everything overnight. You've been so isolated that you know almost nothing about normal life. You've never handled money. You don't know how ordinary people live. You've barely left Kensington Palace grounds. Lord Melbourne suggests a tour of the country. Your Majesty, says the Baroness, who has remained as your trusted companion. The people wish to see their new queen. And see you they do. When you undertake your first royal tour, crowds fill the streets in every town. They throw flowers before your carriage. They cheer until they're hoarse. After the excesses and scandals of your uncles, the people are enchanted by the idea of a young, innocent queen. They seem to like me. You marvel to Melbourne after one particularly enthusiastic welcome. They love you, ma'am, he replies. You represent hope and a fresh beginning. Wait, I need to talk about Lord Melbourne for a second. Picture the ideal father figure, mentor, friend, all rolled into one distinguished package. That was Melbourne to young Victoria. He was 58 to her 18, widowed, childless, and completely devoted to guiding this young queen. He taught her everything about politics, governance, and royal duties. He answered her endless questions without condescension. Victoria adored him, writing in her diary that he was so clever, so kind. Some historians think she might have had a crush on him, which would be totally understandable for a teenager suddenly spending hours every day with a charming, attentive older man who treated her with respect for the first time in her life. For nearly 4 years, Melbourne was Victoria's rock. He advised her through political crises and royal scandals, including one of the first major PR disasters of her reign, the Lady Flora affair. Oh man, the Lady Flora affair was messy. One of Victoria's mother's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Flora Hastings, started showing signs of what looked like pregnancy. Victoria, who despised anyone associated with her mother and Conroy, believed the rumours that Lady Flora was carrying Conroy's child. Victoria basically slut-shamed her publicly, forcing her to undergo a humiliating medical examination. Turns out Lady Flora wasn't pregnant. She had a massive tumour on her liver. She died soon after, and the public briefly turned on Victoria for her cruelty. It wasn't Victoria's finest moment, but it showed how deep her trauma and resentment ran. This poised young queen still carried the scars of her controlled childhood, but the defining relationship of Victoria's life was yet to begin. In October 1839, her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, came to visit the English court. Now, Victoria had met Albert briefly 3 years earlier and found him pleasant but unexciting. This time was different. Albert, at 20, had grown into a strikingly handsome man, tall with dark curly hair and bright blue eyes. He was serious, intelligent, and shared Victoria's love of music and art. "He is so handsome," you write in your diary that night. "His eyes are so blue and beautiful. His mouth is lovely." Within 5 days of his arrival, you're completely smitten, but there's an interesting wrinkle in this royal romance. As queen, you can't be proposed to. You must do the proposing. On October 15th, 1839, you summon Albert to your private study. Your hands are trembling slightly, but your voice is steady. "I would like to ask you, Cousin Albert, if you would do me the honour of marrying me?" Albert's serious face breaks into a radiant smile. He accepts immediately, taking your hands in his. "We will be very happy together," he promises. For once, a promise about your future actually comes true. The wedding takes place on February 10th, 1840, at the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace. Unlike modern royal brides, you don't wear a tiara, just a simple wreath of orange blossoms in your hair. But you do start a tradition that continues to this day. You wear white. Before Victoria, royal brides wore heavily embroidered gowns in rich colours. Her choice of a simple white dress revolutionized wedding fashion forever. This is one of the rare royal marriages that's actually a love match. Albert is intelligent, principled, and genuinely devoted to you. He's also strikingly handsome, as contemporary accounts never fail to mention. "It was the happiest day of my life," you write in your journal that night. The wedding night itself is a revelation. Despite Victorian stereotypes, Victoria actually enjoyed sex with Albert tremendously. In private letters, she described the heavenly beauty of their intimate life together. She would later write to her eldest daughter that sexual fulfillment was one of the greatest joys of marriage and God's intention. Despite enjoying the physical aspects of marriage, Victoria was less enthusiastic about its consequences. Within weeks of the wedding, you're pregnant with your first child. "I am not at all fond of babies generally," you confide in your diary. "I think they are very disgusting when they are small." Despite this initial reluctance, Victoria and Albert would eventually have 9 children together, 9 pregnancies in 17 years. Victoria honestly hated being pregnant, calling it the shadow side of marriage. She suffered terrible morning sickness and complained about looking like a rabbit or a guinea pig when pregnant. After giving birth, she experienced what we now recognise as postpartum depression. But Albert is a devoted husband and father. Unlike most aristocratic men of the time, he's actively involved with his children. He plays with them, teaches them, and helps design their education. He romps with the children in a way that makes my heart swell. You write, "After watching Albert rolling on the floor with your oldest daughter, Vicky." Together, you and Albert create a new ideal of royal family life. Domestic, moral, and outwardly perfect. You commission paintings showing your growing family in intimate, informal settings. The public, embracing the new middle-class values of home and family, adores these glimpses of royal domesticity. But while you're creating this picture-perfect royal family, the country you rule is changing at a pace never before seen in human history. Beyond the palace walls, Britain is transforming from a rural agricultural society into the world's first industrial superpower. Lord Melbourne says the population of Manchester has tripled in 20 years, you remark to Albert over breakfast one morning. He says the factories there run day and night. Albert, always intellectually curious, is fascinated by these changes. "We must see these industrial cities for ourselves," he says. "A monarch should understand how her people live." And so, in the autumn of 1843, you undertake a royal tour of the industrial north. What you see there will change your understanding of the country you rule. The train journey itself is a marvel, moving faster than any human in history had travelled before the railway age. Chugging along at 30 miles per hour, watching the countryside blur past the windows is both thrilling and slightly terrifying. But it's when you arrive in Manchester that the true shock comes. The city is almost unrecognisable as a human habitation. Hundreds of factory chimneys belch thick black smoke that blots out the sun. The buildings are stained black with soot. The air burns your lungs and makes your eyes water. I can scarcely believe this is part of my kingdom, you whisper to Albert as your carriage processes through streets lined with cheering crowds. Behind the crowds, you glimpse narrow alleys where pale, thin children in ragged clothes watch silently. The contrast between your life of palace luxury and the harsh reality of industrial Britain is stark. While you sleep on fine linen sheets in vast royal bedrooms, factory workers in Manchester might share a single room with an entire family, sleeping on straw pallets on the floor. While you enjoy 7-course dinners served on gold plate, children as young as 5 or 6 work 14-hour days in thundering factories or crawl through dangerous mine shafts. This is the paradox at the heart of the Victorian age, unprecedented progress and prosperity existing alongside desperate poverty and exploitation. It's a world changing faster than anyone can comprehend, where ancient ways of life are disappearing and new ones emerging overnight. And at the centre of it all sits a young woman who never expected to be queen, whose own childhood was a kind of gilded prison, now responsible for navigating her nation through the most rapid transformation in human history. We must do something, Albert says quietly, that night, after you've returned to your hotel. The conditions in those factories, the children working the looms. What can be done? You ask. Lord Melbourne says interference in business would damage the economy. Albert shakes his head. There must be a middle path between unfettered capitalism and state control, regulations to protect the most vulnerable, particularly children. This conversation, or ones very like it, led to real reforms. Albert became a passionate advocate for improving working conditions, public health and education. Victoria, influenced by her husband, supported many of these causes. But the scale of the challenge was immense. Britain in the 1840s was a nation in the throes of massive transformation. The population was exploding, from about 16 million when Victoria came to the throne to nearly 40 million by the end of her reign. People were flooding from rural areas into rapidly growing cities that had no infrastructure to support them. Sanitation, housing, public health, all were overwhelmed. In 1842, a shocking report revealed the horrifying conditions in mines and factories. Children as young as 4 or 5 working in pitch-black coal mines, girls harnessed like animals to coal carts, crawling through tunnels on all fours, factory accidents that mangled workers' bodies with no compensation or safety regulations. Reading these reports in the comfort of Buckingham Palace, you feel a weight of responsibility settling on your shoulders. The gap between your life and your subjects seems unbridgeable. Sometimes I wish I could walk among them unrecognised, you confide to Albert one evening, to truly understand how they live. Perhaps we cannot experience their lives, Albert replies, but we can work to improve them. In the early years of your reign, that improvement took many forms. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited women and children under 10 from working underground. The Factory Act of 1844 limited children's working hours and required dangerous machinery to be fenced off. These were small steps, but important ones. Meanwhile, your family continues to grow. By 1846, you have 5 children, with 4 more to come. Despite your initial reluctance about motherhood, you develop deep bonds with your children, especially your eldest daughter Vicky and your second child, Bertie, the future King Edward VII. Family life at Windsor Castle or Balmoral in Scotland gives you respite from the cares of state. Albert has redesigned parts of both residences to create comfortable, almost middle-class family spaces within the grand royal palaces. You play with the children, sketch, play piano, and enjoy quiet domestic evenings that would have been recognisable to any well-off Victorian family. One of the family traditions Albert brings from his German homeland will transform British culture forever: the Christmas tree. In 1848, the Illustrated London News publishes an engraving showing your family gathered around a decorated tree at Windsor Castle. Within a decade, Christmas trees are a fixture in middle-class Victorian homes. The children were wild with delight, you write in your journal on Christmas Eve, 1850. Albert arranged everything himself, as he always does. The tree was lit by small wax tapers and decorated with small gifts and sweets. The children could hardly be contained when they were finally allowed to see it. This scene, the devoted family gathered around the tree, the carefully chosen gifts, the emphasis on children's joy, would define the Victorian invention of the modern Christmas. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, had already begun to transform the holiday from a rowdy adult celebration to a child-centered family festival. Your royal example cemented these new traditions. But while you're creating picture-perfect Christmases within palace walls, the country faces a catastrophe that will test your leadership. In the autumn of 1845, reports begin to arrive of a strange disease affecting potato crops in Ireland. By 1846, it's clear that this is no ordinary crop failure, but a full-scale famine. The reports from Ireland are grave indeed, Lord John Russell, your new Prime Minister, informs you. The potato crop has failed completely in many counties. There are already reports of starvation. What follows is one of the darkest chapters in British history. The Great Hunger will kill around 1 million people in Ireland and force another million to emigrate. The government response is woefully inadequate, hampered by laissez-faire economic policies and anti-Irish prejudice. You personally donate $2,000 to famine relief, a substantial sum worth millions in today's money. You issue a Queen's letter to be read in every church calling for donations to help the Irish, but the scale of the disaster overwhelms these efforts. In later years, you'll be called the Famine Queen in Ireland, blamed for a catastrophe that was partly natural disaster, partly political failure. The truth, as always, is more complicated than the myths that grow up around it. As the 1840s draw to a close, Britain is a nation of stark contrasts. Unprecedented wealth exists alongside grinding poverty. Technological marvels like the telegraph and railway transform daily life, while ancient diseases like cholera still ravage crowded cities. The Crystal Palace is rising in Hyde Park to showcase the wonders of British industry at the Great Exhibition of 1851, while in the slums of London, children die of starvation and neglect. And at the centre of it all, a young queen and her beloved husband try to chart a path forward, to use their influence to shape a changing world. Victoria is no longer the isolated, controlled princess of Kensington Palace. She has found her voice, her power, and in Albert, a partner who shares her vision of what a modern monarchy should be. "We have much to be grateful for," Albert says one evening in 1850, as you sit by the fire in your private apartments at Windsor. Outside, the winter wind howls around the ancient castle, but inside all is warm and peaceful. Your older children are asleep upstairs, the baby dozing in a cradle nearby. "Sometimes I can scarcely believe how far I have come from those gloomy rooms at Kensington," you reply, taking his hand. Little do you know that the greatest challenges and the greatest grief still lie ahead. Wake up. No, not in your comfortable bed. not with your temperature-controlled room and filtered air. You're waking up in a small, windowless room in Manchester, 1848. Your eyes sting before they even open. The air is thick with coal smoke that seeps through the cracks in the walls. You're not alone. 5 other people are crammed into this 10 by 12 foot space, sleeping on straw pallets laid directly on the dirt floor. Get up, boy, mill whistles blown. A rough hand shakes your shoulder. It's your father, already dressed in the same clothes he wore yesterday and the day before that. Washing clothes is a luxury that happens maybe once a month. Welcome to the other side of Victorian Britain, far from the palace walls and royal Christmas trees. This is where the Industrial Revolution actually happens, in cramped, disease-ridden slums where the workers who power the British Empire barely survive. "I've got the cough again," your little sister wheezes from her pallet in the corner. She's 7, with spindly limbs and a hollow-cheeked face. In a wealthy family, she'd be protected, educated, cherished. Here she'll start working in the cotton mill next year. Her small fingers perfect for tying broken threads in the thundering machines. Let me paint a picture of a Victorian industrial city for you. Imagine hundreds of factory chimneys belching black smoke so thick it blocks out the sun, streets running with open sewage and factory waste, buildings packed so tightly together that entire neighborhoods never see direct sunlight. The air doesn't just smell bad, it burns your lungs and coats your throat with grit. Your snot comes out black at the end of the day. Your eyes constantly water. Your skin is never truly clean. No time for breakfast, your father says. We're late. Late means docked wages or even losing your job. And losing your job in Victorian England might actually kill you because there's no safety net, no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, just the workhouse, the last stop before starvation. You pull on your clothes, the same ones you've worn all week, and follow your father into the narrow street. It's barely dawn, but the city is already alive with the sounds of thousands of workers heading to factories. The cobblestones are slick with some unidentifiable muck. You try not to think about what it might be. Something dead, probably. The smell suggests as much. The overseer says I might move up to the spinning floor next month, your father says, his breath visible in the cold morning air. 2 more shillings a week. 2 more shillings. The difference between meat once a week or twice. The difference between candles for light or darkness. These tiny gradations of poverty define working-class life. In the 1840s, Manchester's population exploded from about 75,000 to over 300,000 in just a few decades. People flooded in from the countryside, drawn by the promise of factory jobs. The city couldn't build housing fast enough. What they did build was often shoddy, crowded, and dangerous. As you walk, the streets get more crowded. Women carrying babies on their hips, old men hobbling on coal-black legs, children as young as 5 heading to work in the mines or factories. Everyone has the same grey pallor, the same hollow-eyed exhaustion. "Did you hear about the Turner boy?" a woman asks your father as you pass. "Lost his arm in the loom yesterday. Company says it's his fault for reaching in while it was running." Your father just nods grimly. Everyone knows someone who's been mangled by machinery. There are no safety guards, no regulations. The machines run constantly, and if you're too slow or too tired, they'll take your fingers, your hand, your arm, and then you're useless, unable to work, destined for the workhouse or the street. The mill looms ahead, a 7-story brick monstrosity with hundreds of windows. Even from outside you can hear the thunder of the machines, feel it in your chest like a second heartbeat. "See you at dinner break," your father says, heading to the men's entrance while you go through the children's door. Inside, the noise hits you like a physical force, hundreds of mechanical looms clacking and banging, the hiss of steam, the shouts of overseers. It's so loud that workers develop a special sign language to communicate. Many go partially deaf within years. But it's not just the noise that assaults you, it's the heat and humidity. The cotton threads break less often if the air is damp, so they keep the factories hot and steamy. In summer, temperatures can reach 100 degrees. Workers sometimes collapse from heat exhaustion. And the cotton fluff, it's everywhere, floating in the air like toxic snow, settling on your clothes, your skin, in your lungs. Biocinosis, brown lung disease, is what they'll eventually call it, this slow suffocation that turns so many textile workers into hollow-chested ghosts by their 30s. "You're 2 minutes late, boy," shouts Mr. Jenkins, the floor overseer. "That's a penny off your wages." A penny might not sound like much, but when you're making maybe 3 shillings a week, about $15 in today's money, every penny counts. Victorian factory discipline was brutal and unyielding. Some factories had a system of fines so extensive that workers might lose a quarter of their wages for infractions like talking, sitting down, or opening a window for fresh air. Your job is to crawl under the massive looms when threads break or the fabric tangles. It's dangerous work. The machines don't stop, and you're squeezing between moving parts that could crush you in an instant. But small bodies fit where adults can't go, and children are cheaper to employ. 10 hours. That's your workday since the 10 Hours Act of 1847. Before that, 12 or 14 hours was common, children as young as 5 working from dawn until after dark. The reformers who pushed through the 10-hour day were considered radical for suggesting that maybe, just maybe, children shouldn't work themselves to death before puberty. When dinner break finally comes, you sit on the floor with the other children, eating a piece of bread spread with dripping, congealed animal fat. If your family was doing well this week, there might be a chunk of cheese or an onion, a sip of water from a communal dipper. 20 minutes, then back to work. "Did you see the Queen is having another baby?" one of the older girls says between bites. "Must be nice being royal." The papers, cheap ones printed on rough paper with sensational headlines, made their way even to factory floors. Victoria's growing family, her dresses, her palaces, they were like fairy tales to people whose entire lives played out within a few grimy blocks. "My mum says the prince is trying to help us," another boy offers. "Says he's talking to Parliament about the sewage and stuff." Prince Albert was indeed one of the more progressive royal figures when it came to social reform. He was genuinely disturbed by the conditions in industrial cities and pushed for improvements in housing, sanitation, and education. But good intentions at the top translated slowly, if at all, to actual changes on the ground. By mid-afternoon, you're exhausted. Your back aches from crawling, your hands are raw from the rough cotton, your lungs burn, but the machines keep running indifferent to human suffering, and so must you. When the whistle finally blows at 6, you emerge into air that would be considered dangerously polluted by modern standards, but feels blessedly fresh compared to the cotton-choked factory. Your father meets you outside, his face grey with fatigue. "Fish and chips tonight," he says, managing a smile. "Your mother got a bit extra from the washing." This is what passes for luxury. Fried fish and potatoes wrapped in newspaper, greasy and salty, and filling in a way your usual dinner of watery soup and bread isn't. Working-class diets in industrial cities were generally poor, heavy on carbs, light on protein and fresh vegetables. Malnutrition was common, especially among children. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was so prevalent that bowed legs were considered a normal part of growing up. As you walk home, you pass through different neighbourhoods, each with its own distinct level of misery. There's the Irish Quarter, where families fleeing the potato famine have crowded into cellars and abandoned buildings. The mortality rate there is twice as high as the rest of the city. Don't stare, your father warns as you pass a group of hollow-eyed children picking through a pile of garbage. That could be us if the work dries up. This wasn't hyperbole. The Victorian working class lived perpetually on the edge of catastrophe. One illness, one accident, one economic downturn, and a family could slide from precarious stability into outright destitution. Back home, your mother has already returned from her job as a washerwoman. Her hands are red and cracked from lye soap and hot water. She's hung laundry on lines crisscrossing your single room, creating a damp, steamy atmosphere that's both uncomfortable and practical. The only way to dry clothes in a space without adequate ventilation. They're saying cholera's back in the East End, she says quietly to your father. 3 families down already. Cholera. The word sends a chill down your spine. You've seen what it does. The violent diarrhea and vomiting, the way a healthy person can be dead within hours, the blue-tinged skin of the dying. In 1848, no one really understood how cholera spread. Some blamed miasma, bad air. Others thought it was a punishment from God for immorality. Only a few doctors were beginning to suspect it had something to do with contaminated water. The truth was horrifying. In most industrial cities, drinking water was drawn from the same rivers where sewage was dumped. In London, the Thames was both the main source of drinking water and the city's largest sewer. During cholera outbreaks, people were literally drinking each other's waste. We'll get some lime tomorrow, your father says. Sprinkle it around the door. Lime was thought to purify the air and prevent disease. It didn't work against cholera, which spread through water, but it might help with the constant problem of vermin, the rats, mice, bedbugs and lice that plagued working-class homes. Your little sister's cough sounds worse tonight. In the flickering light of the single candle, her face looks flushed. She's burning up, your mother says, laying a hand on the child's forehead. The worry in her voice is clear. Childhood diseases were killers in Victorian England. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, they swept through crowded neighbourhoods like wildfire, leaving tiny coffins in their wake. Should we call the doctor? You ask. Your parents exchange glances. A doctor costs money you don't have. There's no national health service, no health insurance. Medical care is a luxury for the working poor. I'll make her some onion syrup, your mother says finally. Folk remedies were often the only medicine available. Some worked, most didn't, but they were better than nothing. As you settle onto your pallet for the night, your sister's ragged breathing fills the small room. You're bone-tired, but sleep comes fitfully in these conditions. The walls are thin enough that you can hear your neighbours arguing, a baby crying, someone coughing wetly in the room above. Bedbugs bite when the candle goes out, leaving itchy welts by morning. This was life for the majority of people in industrial Britain, not the sanitised romantic version that shows up in costume dramas. It was brutal, grinding poverty with little hope of escape. Child mortality in poor neighbourhoods hovered around 50%. Half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Adult life expectancy in Manchester was 17 years lower than in rural areas. Meanwhile, across the country, another kind of ecological disaster was unfolding, one that would finally force Parliament to confront the sanitation crisis. London in the summer of 1858 became the site of what historians would later call the Great Stink. Years of dumping raw sewage directly into the Thames had created a river that was more waste than water. When an unusually hot summer hit, the stench became so unbearable that Parliament had to suspend sessions. Members hung sheets soaked in chloride of lime over the windows in a futile attempt to mask the smell. My nose was assailed by the most disgusting stench I have ever had the misfortune to smell, wrote one MP. It was like 1,000 privies emptied at once. The great stink finally accomplished what decades of reports about cholera deaths among the poor could not. It convinced the government to invest in a modern sewage system. The stench had reached the noses of the powerful, and suddenly sanitation became a priority. Joseph Bazalgette, a brilliant engineer, designed a network of sewers that would transform London. Over 100 miles of brick tunnels and pipes were built, diverting sewage away from the Thames and toward treatment plants downstream. It was one of the largest civil engineering projects of the 19th century, employing thousands of workers and using enough bricks to circle the globe twice. When completed in 1865, Bazalgette's sewer system immediately reduced deaths from cholera and typhoid. It's estimated to have added 20 years to the average Londoner's life expectancy. Similar systems would eventually be built in other industrial cities, though many poor neighbourhoods had to wait decades for proper sanitation. The Great Stink illustrated a fundamental truth about Victorian society. Reform typically happened not out of compassion for the suffering of the poor, but when problems became so severe they affected the comfortable lives of the wealthy and powerful. Back in Manchester, your family's daily struggle continues. Your sister's cough improves slightly with your mother's remedies, but she remains thin and pale. Factory work has already stunted her growth, as it has yours. Adult workers who started in factories as children were often several inches shorter than their middle-class counterparts, their bodies permanently shaped by malnutrition and overwork. There's a school opened in the church, your mother mentions one evening. Free lessons on Sundays. Education, like healthcare, was not a right but a privilege in early Victorian England. There was no national system of schools until late in the century. Working-class children who received any education at all often attended Sunday schools, so named because Sunday was the only day they weren't working. What good is reading to a factory boy? Your father asks, not unkindly. The practical realities of survival often trumped aspirations for education or advancement. Yet despite this hard-scrabble existence, working-class communities were not just collections of misery. They developed rich cultures of mutual aid and solidarity. Neighbours who had almost nothing themselves would still take in orphaned children rather than see them sent to the dreaded workhouse. Families pooled resources during tough times. Communities organised funeral clubs so no one would suffer the ultimate Victorian shame, a pauper's burial. Music halls provided cheap entertainment. Street vendors sold everything from meat pies to second-hand clothes. Religious organisations offered not just spiritual comfort but practical help. Soup kitchens, clothing distributions, basic medical care. "Did you hear they're putting in gas lamps on the main road?" your mother says as she darns a sock by candlelight. "Mrs. Higgins says they'll burn all night. Imagine that. Streets you can see in after dark." The technological marvels of the age were gradually filtering down to even poor neighbourhoods. Gaslighting, indoor plumbing, for some, mass-produced goods that made small luxuries more affordable. Progress was coming, albeit slowly and unevenly. One evening, something unusual happens. A well-dressed gentleman appears in your neighbourhood, knocking on doors and asking questions. He's accompanied by a local minister who seems to know everyone. "It's one of them government inspectors," your neighbour whispers, "writing a report on housing," they say. The 1840s saw the rise of the social investigator, middle and upper-class reformers who ventured into poor neighbourhoods to document living conditions. Their reports, shocking to comfortable readers, helped build momentum for reform. When they knock on your door, your parents are clearly uncomfortable with these higher-class visitors seeing your cramped, damp living quarters, but the inspector is respectful, asking about your work, your health, your wages. He takes notes in a small book, nodding gravely. 7 people in 1 room, he mutters. No ventilation, no sanitation. Exactly as Dr. Chadwick described. Edwin Chadwick's 1842 Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population had been a landmark document explicitly connecting poor housing conditions to disease and high mortality. It helped spark the public health movement that would gradually improve living conditions in industrial cities. As the inspector leaves, he presses a coin into your sister's hand. For fruit, he says kindly, fresh fruit helps with chest ailments. Your sister stares at the sixpence in wonder. It's more money than she's ever held. Can we really buy fruit? She asks after the visitors leave. Tomorrow, your mother promises. We'll get an orange and share it. An orange, an exotic luxury, imported from Spain or Portugal, something most working-class children might taste only at Christmas, if then. This small kindness, this tiny glimpse of something better carries your family through another grueling week of factory work and persistent poverty, and that's how progress often came in Victorian Britain, not in grand sweeping changes, but in incremental improvements fought for by reformers, reluctantly granted by authorities, gradually improving the most desperate conditions while leaving the fundamental structure of society intact. Meanwhile, in London's West End, another vision of Victorian life was taking shape, one of department stores with plate glass windows displaying unimaginable luxuries, of wide boulevards swept clean of refuse, of comfortable middle-class homes with servants and indoor plumbing. The Great Exhibition of 1851 would soon showcase Britain's industrial might to the world, presenting a sanitized, triumphant narrative of progress that conveniently erased the human cost of that prosperity. These parallel Victorian Englands, the grinding poverty of industrial workers and the prosperous comfort of the middle and upper classes, existed side by side, separate worlds occupying the same geography. Prince Albert himself recognised this contradiction, writing, "The wealth which the manufacturing districts have accumulated has been partially distributed very unequally and has called into existence an entirely new population, for which no place has been provided in the social system of the country." As you drift off to sleep that night, your sister's breathing sounds a little easier. Tomorrow will bring another day of factory work, another fight for survival, but perhaps, just perhaps, things might someday get better. The inspector's visit, the promised orange, the new gas lamps, tiny pinpricks of light in an otherwise dark existence. What you don't know, what you can't know, is that you're living through a pivotal moment in human history, the birth pangs of modern industrial society. The suffering of the Victorian working class would eventually lead to labour laws, public health measures, universal education, and the rudiments of a social safety net. But that future remains distant, uncertain, visible only in the faintest glimmers of reform. For now, you pull your thin blanket closer against the night chill and dream of oranges. Have you ever felt like you were looking through a window into another world? That's exactly what it was like in Hyde Park, London, on May 1st, 1851. Imagine yourself standing among 25,000 people crammed into a building made entirely of glass. The sunlight streams through 300,000 panes, creating rainbows that dance across the polished floors. Above you soars a barrel-vaulted roof tall enough to enclose fully grown elm trees. This is the Crystal Palace, centerpiece of the Great Exhibition, the most ambitious showcase of human achievement the world has ever seen. It's like a cathedral built for industry instead of God, murmurs a well-dressed woman next to you clutching her husband's arm, and she's not wrong. The Crystal Palace was, frankly, bonkers. Picture a massive greenhouse big enough to hold a small town, 1,851 feet long, deliberately matching the year, and 454 feet wide. Inside were 100,000 exhibits from around the world: steam engines, printing presses, sculptures, furniture, textiles, and the largest diamond in the world, the Koh-i-Noor from India. "Look at that," a father tells his wide-eyed son, pointing at a massive hydraulic press. "That's the future, my boy." Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was the driving force behind this spectacle. The exhibition was his baby, a showcase for British innovation and a celebration of the industrial progress transforming the world. Victoria herself visited almost daily during its 6-month run, bringing her children to gape at the wonders on display. "The Queen's here today," whispers a guard to his colleague as you pass. Third time this week, Prince says she's fascinated by the Indian textiles. But here's what makes the Great Exhibition so fascinating as a window into Victorian society. For a brief moment, it brought together people from every class in a shared experience of wonder. The price of admission was deliberately set on a sliding scale, from a shilling on cheap days, affordable to skilled workers, up to 5 shillings on regular days for middle-class visitors, and much higher for the opening ceremonies and special events. 6 million people, equivalent to a third of Britain's population, visited during its run. Factory workers saved for weeks to afford the cheap tickets and train fare to London. The wealthy arrived in carriages, the middle classes by omnibus, the poor on foot. "They've got a proper water closet here," says a workingman, gesturing to his wife with excitement. "Flushes away the waste with water. Imagine that in our neighbourhood." For many visitors, the plumbing was as impressive as the industrial marvels. The Crystal Palace featured public toilets, a novelty for most, with actual flushing mechanisms. Over 827,000 visitors used them during the exhibition. Yes, they kept count. But as you wander from the exhibition back into London's streets, the illusion of a unified society quickly shatters. Step just a few blocks from Hyde Park and you'll find yourself in neighbourhoods where people live in conditions barely better than animals. London in 1851 was essentially 2 separate cities occupying the same space. The London of Buckingham Palace, gentlemen's clubs, department stores and gaslit theatres existed alongside a shadow city of slums, workhouses and grinding poverty. "Mind yourself," warns a constable as you turn down a narrow alley. "This isn't a place for decent folk after dark." The alley opens into a courtyard surrounded by crumbling tenements. Children with dirty faces play in the mud. A woman empties a chamber pot from an upper window, barely missing the passers-by below. The stench of rotting food, human waste, and unwashed bodies is overwhelming. This is St Giles, one of London's most notorious slums, known to locals as the Rookery. Similar neighbourhoods, Jacob's Island, Seven Dials, Saffron Hill, dotted the city like islands of misery amid growing prosperity. Charles Dickens, who knew these streets well, described Jacob's Island as the filthiest, the strangest, the most extraordinary of the many localities that are hidden in London. His novels didn't exaggerate the conditions. If anything, they sanitized them for his middle-class readers. The class divide in Victorian Britain wasn't just about money, it was a complete separation of realities. Different classes lived in different neighbourhoods, ate different foods, wore different clothes, even spoke differently. Most importantly, they faced wildly different odds of basic survival. Let me show you what I mean. It's morning in Mayfair, one of London's wealthiest neighbourhoods. In a grand townhouse, the Earl of Harrington's day begins around 9 a.m. A valet draws his curtains, helps him dress, and presents a breakfast of coffee, toast, eggs, kidneys, bacon, and fish, all served on fine china. The Earl's clothes for a typical day would include a tailored shirt with detachable collar, a waistcoat, a cravat or necktie, a frock coat, pressed trousers, polished boots, and a top hat if he's going out. The outfit represents the yearly income of a skilled worker. Meanwhile, in a one-room dwelling in Seven Dials, Jacob Miller, a dock worker, has already been up for hours. He left for work at 5 a.m. after a breakfast of bread and dripping, congealed fat, washed down with tea so weak you could read a newspaper through it. His wife and 5 children share the single room, which costs half their weekly income in rent. Jacob owns one set of clothes, patched repeatedly. When they're washed, rarely, water must be carried from a communal pump. He has to stay in bed until they dry. His boots have cardboard stuffed in the soles to cover the holes. The gentleman who draws the water cart says there's cholera on Bell Street. Jacob's wife tells a neighbour as they queue at the pump, 3 dead since Tuesday. Disease was perhaps the great equalizer. It affected all classes, but its impact varied dramatically depending on your social position. When cholera struck, the wealthy fled to country estates. The middle classes closed their windows and disinfected their homes with carbolic acid. The poor, crowded into filthy neighbourhoods with no sanitation, died in droves. "My sister lost 3 in a week," the neighbour replies, filling her bucket from the communal pump, the same pump that might be contaminated with sewage from nearby cesspits. They buried them in the same box to save on the funeral. A pauper's funeral was the ultimate Victorian shame. Unable to afford a proper burial, the poorest had their dead taken by the parish for interment in mass graves, sometimes dozens of bodies piled in a single pit. The horror of this fate led even the most destitute families to prioritise burial insurance, weekly payments to funeral clubs that would ensure a dignified funeral with a coffin, hearse, and individual grave. "We pay 2pence a week for each of us," Jacob's wife explains. "Better to go hungry now than be thrown in a pauper's hole at the end." The Victorian obsession with respectability created peculiar priorities. Families that could barely afford food would spend precious pennies on boot polish, clean collars, and funeral insurance, the visible markers of being decent folk rather than the truly destitute. For those who fell to the bottom rung of society, one institution loomed like a nightmare: the workhouse. The Victorian workhouse wasn't just a shelter for the homeless or unemployed. It was a deliberately punitive institution designed to make poverty so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek help. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, known to critics as the New Poor Law, established that anyone receiving public assistance had to enter a workhouse. "My John would rather die in the street than go to that place," an elderly woman says, her gnarled hands trembling. "They separate man and wife, 30 years married, and they'd put us in different buildings like criminals." She's not exaggerating. Workhouses were designed to break family bonds. Husbands and wives were housed separately and might go months without seeing each other. Children over 7 were taken from their mothers. Inmates wore uniforms, followed strict schedules, ate bland food in silent dining halls, and performed tedious, often pointless labour, breaking stones, picking oakum, unravelling old ropes into fibres, or turning cranks that produced nothing. "My grandson was in the Lambeth workhouse," the old woman continues, said the gruel was so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through it, and never enough. Growing boy needs more than that. Oliver Twist's famous request, "Please sir, I want some more," resonated with Victorian readers precisely because they knew such a simple plea would be treated as outrageous insolence in the real workhouses of the time. The workhouse cast such a long shadow of fear that many families would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid it, including slow starvation, dangerous work, prostitution, or crime. Better the devil you know than the workhouse devil, as a common saying went. Across town, in a comfortable villa in the new suburb of Bayswater, the Davis family represents another reality entirely, the rising Victorian middle class. Mr. Davis is a bank clerk earning $300 a year, about $45,000 in today's money. They employ 3 servants, a cook, a housemaid, and a nursemaid for their 4 children. Mrs. Davis has never cleaned a floor, washed clothes, or cooked a meal in her married life. Her days revolve around managing the household, making social calls, and raising her children. The family eats 3 substantial meals daily, with meat at both lunch and dinner. "I've ordered a new dress for Lady Simmons' garden party," Mrs. Davis tells her husband over breakfast. "The blue silk was simply too old-fashioned. Mrs. Phillips had almost the same style at church last Sunday." For middle-class Victorian women, appearances were everything. Their homes, clothes, manners, and children were all reflections of their social standing. Maintaining this facade often required ruthless economizing behind the scenes, cutting corners on servants' food to afford better cuts of meat for the family table, or darning sheets in private while presenting an immaculate front parlour to visitors. The Victorian middle class was obsessed with moral respectability, especially as many were just a generation removed from working-class origins. They embraced rigid codes of behaviour, religious observance, and social etiquette as ways to distance themselves from their roots. "The Browns have let their daughter walk out with that young shopkeeper," Mrs. Davis says disapprovingly. "I always said they were a bit common." Social climbing was an art form with elaborate rules about who could associate with whom. Trade was looked down upon by professionals, who were in turn considered inferior to the gentry. Subtle distinctions in accent, vocabulary, and manners instantly identified someone's precise place in the social hierarchy. Meanwhile, back in the Davis household, 15-year-old Mary, the housemaid, has been working since dawn. She's cleaned grates, lit fires, carried hot water to bedrooms, emptied chamber pots, swept floors, and dusted furniture, all before the family came down to breakfast. "Girl, the brass on the front door isn't properly polished," Mrs. Davis scolds. "See to it immediately." Mary curtsies and hurries away. She works 16 hours a day, with half a day off on Sundays and every other Thursday afternoon. Her annual wage of $12, about $2,800 today, seems a fortune compared to factory work, though most goes home to her struggling family. Domestic service was the largest employer of women in Victorian Britain. By 1900, 40% of all female workers were servants. For many working-class girls, it offered a path to literacy, regular meals, and decent housing, though at the cost of near-total loss of personal freedom and often exposure to exploitation or abuse. "The master's son tried to corner me in the pantry again," Mary confides to the cook when they're alone. "I told him I'd scream so loud his mother would hear." Sexual harassment and assault of female servants was so common it was a standard plot point in Victorian literature. With few legal protections and the constant threat of dismissal without a character reference, many young women had little recourse against predatory employers or their sons. Let me take you to one more home before we leave this tour of Victorian class life. In rural Hampshire, about 50 miles from London, the Reverend George Sutton lives with his family in a small but comfortable vicarage. As a country parson with a modest private income, he occupies a curious middle ground, educated and genteel, but far from wealthy. "The roof needs repairs again," he tells his wife over tea in the garden. "I shall have to speak to the bishop about additional funds." Rural life moved at a different pace than the frenetic industrial cities. Here, the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest still dictated much of life, though even agricultural work was being transformed by new machinery. Steam-powered threshers were replacing flail threshing by hand. Horse-drawn reapers were cutting wheat more efficiently than teams with scythes. "The Johnsons have had to let go 3 of their farm labourers," Mrs. Sutton replies. "That new reaping machine does the work of 10 men, George." Agricultural workers were among the most vulnerable in Victorian society. Poorly paid, subject to the whims of weather and harvest, they faced the constant threat of mechanisation eliminating their livelihoods. Many eventually joined the exodus to industrial cities, swapping rural poverty for urban slums in hope of steadier wages. The vicar's position gave him a unique view of his parish's social divisions. He dined occasionally with the local gentry at the manor house, counselled middle-class shopkeepers and farmers, and ministered to the poorest agricultural labourers in their cottages. "I visited the Wilkins family today," he tells his wife. "The youngest has the fever. I've left them what I could, but they need proper medical attention." For rural poor, medical care was often limited to folk remedies, the occasional visit from an overworked doctor, or the vicar's charity. Hospitals existed primarily in cities, and many charged fees beyond the reach of working people. Friendly societies and burial clubs sometimes provided rudimentary health care, but comprehensive medical treatment remained a luxury for most Victorians. Back in London, as evening falls, the 3 worlds we've glimpsed continue their parallel existences. The Earl dines on 7 courses served by liveried footmen before attending the opera. The middle-class Davis family enjoys a modest roast dinner before reading improving literature in their gas-lit parlour. Jacob the dock worker returns to his crowded room, too exhausted to do more than eat a bowl of soup before collapsing into sleep. What unified these disparate experiences? What thread connected the Victorian Earl to the workhouse inmate? One answer might be found in the institutions that were increasingly shaping Victorian lives: schools, hospitals, prisons, asylums, workhouses. The Victorian era saw the rise of bureaucracy and record-keeping, with official forms documenting births, marriages, deaths, crimes, illnesses, and poverty. For the first time, the state was actively categorising and managing its citizens, regardless of class. Another common thread was the unprecedented pace of change. Whether riding in a first-class railway carriage or working on the railway lines, Victorians of all classes were experiencing a world transforming more rapidly than ever before in human history. Technologies that seemed miraculous in 1850 would be commonplace by 1870. Cities doubled in size within decades. Old certainties crumbled while new possibilities emerged. This relentless change created both opportunity and anxiety. The Victorian era saw explosive growth in the middle class as new professions and commercial ventures created paths to prosperity unknown to previous generations. But it also produced new forms of vulnerability, as traditional safety nets of extended family and stable communities frayed in the face of urbanisation and industrialisation. The class system itself was simultaneously becoming more rigid in its social boundaries, while more permeable in terms of mobility. Nouveau riche industrialists might buy country estates but find themselves snubbed by old money neighbours. Educated professionals claimed higher status than wealthy merchants. The expanding empire created opportunities for adventurous souls to reinvent themselves far from home. My cousin went out to India 5 years ago as nothing but a clerk, the vicar's wife mentions. Now he writes that he has a grand house and 10 servants. Could you imagine such a thing happening here? The British Empire opened escape hatches from the strict British class system. A man of modest background could go to India, Africa, or Australia and return wealthy or powerful in ways that would have been impossible had he remained in Britain. Of course, this opportunity came at the enormous cost of colonialism, exploitation, and violence against indigenous peoples, a dark underbelly of Victorian prosperity rarely acknowledged in polite society. As night falls completely over London, gas lamps create pools of light along fashionable streets, while in the slums, darkness reigns except for the occasional candle or oil lamp in a window. The Crystal Palace, that monument to progress and industry, stands silent in Hyde Park, its glass walls reflecting moonlight. For a moment, in that gleaming palace, Victorians had glimpsed a possible future, one of technological marvels, international cooperation, and shared wonder that transcended class. The reality of daily life remained far more divided, but something had shifted. The exhibition had shown what was possible when human ingenuity was unleashed. Prince Albert, whose vision had made the exhibition possible, continued to advocate for reforms that might bridge the chasm between Victorian Britain's parallel worlds, promoting education, public health, and housing improvements. Queen Victoria, initially focused primarily on her growing family and royal duties, was increasingly aware of the conditions her subjects faced, though her responses were often limited by her conservative views and the constitutional constraints on her power. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable in your warm bed with clean water at hand and medical care a phone call away, consider how many of these basic comforts were luxuries beyond reach for most people in the Victorian era, an era not so distant from our own, where the foundations of our modern world were being painfully, imperfectly laid. The cough started in November, just a tickle in the throat at first, nothing serious. By December 11th, 1861, Prince Albert couldn't get out of bed. The royal physicians hovered anxiously, their whispered consultations growing more urgent. Queen Victoria barely left his side, her face drawn with worry. "It's just a fever," she insisted to her eldest daughter. "Your father has always been strong." But this wasn't just any fever. Modern doctors believe it was likely typhoid, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated food or water. In an age before antibiotics, typhoid was often a death sentence. On December 14th, Albert's breathing became laboured. Victoria held his hand as the life slowly drained from the man who had been her partner, advisor, and the great love of her life for 21 years. The clock struck 11:15, Victoria later wrote in her journal. "I asked if he had kissed me. They said yes, but I did not feel it. I went out of the room a moment to go to the dressing room, and I thought I heard a strange, indistinct sound. I returned, and Albert was lying on his back quite still. Prince Albert was dead. He was just 42 years old." The world didn't end that night, but for Victoria, it might as well have. "My life as a happy one is ended," she wrote to her uncle Leopold. "The world is gone for me." Wait, let me set the scene properly. Picture Windsor Castle on that December night. Outside, frost coats the ancient stones. Inside, gas lamps cast flickering shadows on walls hung with rich tapestries. The Prince Consort's bedroom is oppressively hot. Victorian doctors believed fresh air was dangerous for the sick, so the windows are sealed tight despite his fever. The air smells of camphor, beef broth, unsuccessfully offered to the dying man, and the sickly sweet odour of approaching death. Royal attendants move silently across thick carpets, bringing ice to cool the prince's forehead, clean linens, and the various potions prescribed by the physicians, useless concoctions of brandy, quinine, and ammonia that could do nothing against the bacterial invader ravaging Albert's body. Victoria's 5 daughters wait in adjoining rooms, crying softly. Her eldest son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, is kept away, partly because his recent scandalous behaviour at army camp is believed to have contributed to his father's decline by causing him stress. "Papa is with angels now," Princess Alice tells her younger siblings after Albert draws his last breath. This moment, Albert's death in 1861, marks a profound turning point not just in Victoria's life but in the character of the Victorian age itself. The vibrant young queen who had once danced until dawn would now transform into the perpetually mourning widow of Windsor. For the remaining 40 years of her reign, Victoria would wear only black, withdraw from public duties, and build a cult of remembrance around her beloved husband. And in doing so, she would both reflect and intensify one of the most distinctive aspects of Victorian culture, its elaborate relationship with death. The Victorians were obsessed with death, like seriously obsessed, not in a morbid goth teenager way, but as a central ritualized part of everyday life. Death in Victorian England wasn't hidden away in hospitals and nursing homes. It happened at home, in the front parlour, with the whole family gathered around the bed. "My grandmother kept grandfather in the front room for a week after he passed," a lady tells her friend as they shop for mourning clothes. "Had the photographer come to take his portrait before they closed the coffin?" Yes, you heard that right. Post-mortem photography was a common Victorian practice. Families who might never have been able to afford a portrait in life would scrape together money to have a final image of their loved ones after death. Sometimes the deceased would be posed as if sleeping. Sometimes they'd be arranged in family groups, propped up among the living. Children who died young might be posed with favourite toys. To modernise, these images are deeply unsettling. To Victorians, they were precious keepsakes, sometimes the only visual record of a beloved family member. "How long will you wear full mourning?" the friend asks as they examine black-bordered handkerchiefs. "A year and a day for a husband," comes the reply. "Then I can move to second mourning. Some grey or lavender after 18 months, perhaps." Victorian mourning customs were elaborate, strict, and socially enforced, especially for women. After a husband's death, a widow was expected to wear full mourning for at least 2 years, entirely black clothing of dull, non-reflective materials like crepe, no jewellery except jet, a black fossilised wood, and a heavy black veil when in public. This wasn't just fashion, it was a social requirement. A widow who appeared in public too soon after bereavement or in insufficiently sombre attire would face harsh judgment. For poorer women, maintaining an appropriate mourning wardrobe was yet another financial burden, forcing many to dye existing clothes black or go into debt for new ones. Victoria took these customs to an extreme. She remained in full mourning not for the expected 2 years, but for the rest of her life. 40 years of unrelieved black. Her obsession with Albert's memory bordered on the pathological. She kept his rooms exactly as they had been when he died, with hot water brought daily for shaving and his clothes laid out each morning. "The Queen has ordered that the Prince's side of the bed remain turned down," whispers a Windsor castle maid to a new footman. "No one is allowed to touch his brushes or move his pocket watch." Victoria's retreat from public life after Albert's death caused a serious crisis for the monarchy. For years, she refused to open Parliament, attend public functions, or make appearances, while she continued to work diligently behind the scenes, reading state papers, corresponding with ministers, maintaining her detailed journal. Her subjects began to question the value of an invisible queen. What does she do to earn her money? Demanded one newspaper editorial in 1864. Republican sentiment began to grow, with calls for abolishing the monarchy altogether. Mrs. Brown says the Queen is coming to Balmoral next month, a shopkeeper in the Scottish village tells his wife. Another summer, hiding away in the Highlands instead of showing herself to her people. Ah yes, John Brown. We should talk about him because he's key to understanding Victoria's middle years. Brown was a Scottish servant from the Balmoral estate who became Victoria's close companion after Albert's death. Rough-mannered, forthright and utterly devoted to the Queen, he provided the emotional support and practical assistance Victoria desperately needed. Rumours spread that they were lovers, or even secretly married, leading to Victoria being nicknamed Mrs. Brown by critics. While historians generally believe the relationship remained non-romantic, it clearly provided Victoria with comfort during her darkest years. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria was devastated all over again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's zoom out from Windsor Castle and Victoria's personal grief to see how the Victorian relationship with death shaped society more broadly. Death in Victorian England was ever present in a way that's difficult for us to imagine today. The average life expectancy for a labourer in Liverpool was just 15 years. In London, it was 26 for working-class men. Even the wealthy weren't spared. Infectious diseases like typhoid, cholera and tuberculosis could strike anyone. Children were especially vulnerable. Infant mortality ran as high as 50% in poor areas. Victorian literature is filled with deathbed scenes of angelic children because these were common experiences that resonated with readers who had lost their own little ones. The Thompson baby was buried yesterday, a woman tells her neighbour as they hang laundry in a London courtyard. That's 3 she's lost before their first birthday. The little angels are watching over her from heaven, I suppose. This familiarity with death created a culture where mortality was acknowledged and prepared for rather than denied. Victorians invested heavily in the good death, a peaceful passing at home, surrounded by family, with time for proper farewells and spiritual preparation. The funeral industry boomed as never before. Elaborate funeral processions became status symbols with horse-drawn hearses sporting black ostrich plumes, professional mourners hired to walk behind the coffin, and specially designed mourning jewellery containing locks of the deceased's hair. For the wealthy, funerals could be extraordinarily lavish affairs. When the Duke of Wellington died in 1852, his funeral procession included a purpose-built funeral car that weighed 18 tons, drawn by 12 black horses. Over 1 million people lined the streets to watch. At the other end of the social scale, the poor scraped together pennies for burial insurance, terrified of the pauper's grave. Some families kept dead relatives at home for days longer than was safe, desperately trying to gather enough money for a decent burial. My Tommy saved 3 years for his funeral, an elderly widow tells the parish priest, paid every week to the burial society. He always said he'd go into the ground proper, not in the parish pit with strangers. This preoccupation with death wasn't just about fear or superstition. In an era of rapid change and scientific advancement, death remained the great unknown, a mystery that science could study but not solve. This tension between rationalism and spirituality played out in fascinating ways. Take the scientific study of death itself. The Victorian period saw the birth of modern medicine, with tremendous advances in understanding anatomy, disease, and treatment. Medical schools needed cadavers to study, which led to the gruesome practice of body snatching. stealing freshly buried corpses to sell to medical schools, and even to murder, as in the infamous case of Burke and Hare, who killed 16 people to supply bodies to an Edinburgh anatomist. They've put an iron cage over old Mrs. Wilson's grave, a cemetery watchman tells his colleague. Families afraid of the resurrection men coming for her. These mortsafes, iron cages or heavy stone slabs placed over new graves, can still be seen in some British cemeteries today. Silent testimony to the fear of having one's final rest disturbed by body snatchers. The medical advances of the Victorian era were remarkable. Anesthesia was first used in 1842, transforming surgery from a torture to be endured to a painless procedure. Antiseptic techniques pioneered by Joseph Lister in the 1860s dramatically reduced deaths from post-surgical infections. Florence Nightingale revolutionised nursing during the Crimean War, establishing it as a respectable profession based on scientific principles. But these scientific advances existed alongside persistent superstitions and spiritual beliefs about death. The Victorian era saw an explosion of interest in spiritualism, the belief that the dead could communicate with the living through mediums. Mrs. Egerton is hosting a séance on Thursday, a society matron tells her friend over tea. She claims her medium made the table rise completely off the floor last week. Apparently, Lady Westmoreland's dead husband spoke through her. Even Queen Victoria, despite her conventional religious beliefs, showed interest in spiritualism after Albert's death, though she never fully embraced it. Séances, spirit photography, which claimed to capture images of ghosts, automatic writing and Ouija boards became popular pastimes among all classes. For many, these practices offered comfort, the possibility of reconnecting with lost loved ones, while for others, they provided thrilling entertainment in an era before cinema or television. This collision of scientific rationalism with spiritual yearning created the perfect conditions for a literary explosion. The Victorian era gave us both realistic social novels and the birth of fantasy, science fiction, and horror as we know them today. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818 but widely read throughout the Victorian period, explored the ethical implications of science's power over death. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, played on fears of contagion, foreignness, and forbidden sexuality. Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886, examined the duality of human nature. These weren't just entertaining stories, but explorations of the anxieties bubbling beneath Victorian propriety. "Have you read this?" a young man asks his companion at a bookshop, holding up a copy of The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer Lytton. It imagines a superior species living beneath the earth with powers beyond our understanding, makes one wonder what might truly exist beyond our knowledge. This Victorian openness to supernatural possibilities may seem at odds with the era's emphasis on scientific progress, but in many ways they were two sides of the same coin. Both represented attempts to understand and control the unknown. The Victorians built museums to categorize the natural world, invented technologies to master distance and time, and developed sciences to explain human behavior, all while holding seances, writing ghost stories, and keeping locks of hair from their dead loved ones. This paradox extended to their views on medicine and the body. Victorian mainstream medicine made tremendous scientific advances, yet folk remedies and potent medicines, often containing alcohol, cocaine, or opium, remained wildly popular across all classes. "Dr. William's pink pills for pale people cured my sister's nervous debility," a woman tells her friend as they pass an advertising poster, "and Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup works wonders for my baby's teething pains." That soothing syrup, by the way, contained morphine. Many Victorian children were regularly dosed with opiates to keep them quiet. Mercury, arsenic, and strychnine were common ingredients in medical treatments. Cocaine was recommended for everything from toothaches to depression. When Victoria gave birth to her last two children, she used chloroform as an anaesthetic, a controversial decision at the time, as many religious authorities believed women were meant to suffer in childbirth as punishment for Eve's sin. Victoria's royal example helped make pain relief in childbirth more acceptable for ordinary women. By the 1870s, Victoria was slowly emerging from the deepest phase of her mourning, though she would wear black and maintain many mourning customs for the rest of her life. She began to make more public appearances, published books about her life with Albert, and took an increasing interest in her expanding empire. The Queen has agreed to open Parliament this year, an excited newspaper editor tells his staff. First time in ages, I want a full report, what she wore, how she looked, every detail. Victoria's gradual return to public life coincided with a shift in how the monarchy presented itself. Rather than emphasising the Queen's remote majesty, royal publicity increasingly focused on her role as matriarch of a vast family and symbolic mother to her subjects. Images of the grandmother of Europe, surrounded by her numerous children and grandchildren, helped humanize the monarchy and rebuild public support. This familial image of royalty perfectly matched the Victorian era's elevation of domestic life as a moral ideal. The Victorian middle-class home was conceived as a haven from the competitive, amoral world of business, a feminized space of moral virtue presided over by the angel in the house, the ideal Victorian wife and mother. A man's business may take him into all sorts of unsavoury places, a vicar tells a group of young women at a church social, but the virtuous woman creates a home where his better nature may flourish, where the children may be raised in godliness, and where Christian values reign supreme. This idealization of home life was reflected in Victoria and Albert's deliberate presentation of themselves as a model family. Their Christmas celebrations at Windsor, complete with German-style decorated trees, gift-giving, carols and games, established traditions that would be copied by middle-class families across Britain. Even in her widowhood, Victoria maintained this domestic focus, surrounding herself with her children and, eventually, grandchildren at family gatherings at Osborne House, Balmoral and Windsor. But behind the scenes, Victoria's relationship with her 9 children was complex. She was by turns controlling, critical, dependent, and affectionate. Her eldest son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, bore the brunt of her disappointment as she considered him frivolous and inadequate compared to his father. "If only you had half your father's intellect and moral fibre," she wrote to him in one particularly cutting letter. "Ouch, Mom. Tell us how you really feel." Victoria's deep attachment to Albert's memory meant that her children could never quite measure up to their idealized father. She leaned heavily on her daughters, especially Beatrice, her youngest, who was expected to remain unmarried and serve as her mother's companion. When Beatrice eventually did marry, Victoria only consented on the condition that the couple would live with her. "The princess looks happy today," observes a lady-in-waiting to her colleague as they watch Beatrice walking in the gardens with her husband, "though I understand the Queen still requires her to spend every evening reading to her." Victoria's controlling nature extended to her attempts to arrange advantageous marriages for her children, using her extensive family connections across European royalty. Through these marriages, she became literally the grandmother of Europe, with descendants on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Spain, Norway, and Sweden. This web of royal relationships would later have dramatic consequences during World War I, when the crowned heads of Britain, Germany, and Russia, all Victoria's grandchildren, found themselves at war with one another. As the 1870s progressed, Britain continued its transformation. The second wave of industrialization brought new technologies, telephones, typewriters, electric lighting, and improved transportation. Cities expanded outward, with new suburbs connected by omnibuses and commuter railways. Department stores offered middle-class consumers unprecedented choice in clothing, furnishings, and luxury goods. Yet Victoria herself remained somewhat apart from these changes, living much as she had in earlier decades despite the modernising world around her. She disliked the telephone, was suspicious of newfangled electric lights, preferring candles and oil lamps, and maintained formal court customs that were increasingly seen as anachronistic. The Queen insists dinner be served exactly as it was in the Prince's day, an exasperated royal cook tells his assistant. 40 years and the menu hasn't changed. Victoria's devotion to Albert's memory never faded. In the decades after his death, she commissioned numerous memorials. The Royal Albert Hall, the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, and statues across the country and empire. She kept fresh flowers daily on his tomb in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. In her private moments, she still spoke to him, wrote journal entries addressed to him, and believed he watched over her from heaven. When she finally died in 1901, her funeral instructions specified that she be buried with Albert's dressing gown and a plaster cast of his hand, and that a lock of John Brown's hair and his photograph be placed in her coffin, final gestures of devotion to the two men who had meant most to her in life. The Victorian relationship with death, personal, ritualized and acknowledged, stands in sharp contrast to our modern tendency to medicalize, institutionalize and avoid discussing mortality. Their elaborate mourning customs may seem excessive to us, but they provided structure and social support during bereavement in a world where death was a constant companion. As you lie in your comfortable, clean bed tonight, far from the typhoid that killed Albert or the cholera that devastated Victorian cities, consider how these 19th century attitudes toward mortality shaped our modern world, from our funeral practices and cemetery designs to our literary traditions and medical ethics. The Victorians lived with death as an ever-present reality. They built a culture that acknowledged its inevitability while creating meaning through remembrance, ritual, and the hope of reunion beyond the grave. Victoria's 40-year mourning for Albert may seem extreme to modern eyes, but it reflected her era's understanding that grief wasn't something to get over, but rather to incorporate into a life forever changed by loss. Empress of India. The words hung in the air of the ornate cabinet room as Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli presented the proposal to Queen Victoria in 1876, a new title for an ageing queen, a shiny consolation prize after decades of grief. The crown jewel of the British Empire should have a worthy title for its sovereign, Disraeli added, his dark eyes watching the Queen carefully. Victoria, now in her late 50s, considered the idea. She had never visited India and never would, yet this vast subcontinent on the other side of the world, with its ancient civilizations and hundreds of millions of subjects, was now the cornerstone of British imperial power. "I rather like it," she said finally, a rare smile crossing her face. Victoria had been gradually emerging from her deep mourning for Albert. The new title appealed to her. It acknowledged Britain's expanding global power and elevated her status relative to her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm and the other European monarchs. In an era when women had few legal rights, Victoria, paradoxically, wielded influence over the largest empire the world had ever seen. Wait, let me back up, because to understand how Victoria became Empress of India, you need to understand how utterly bonkers the British Empire was during this period. Picture a map of the world in 1876. Now colour 1/4 of it red. That's the British Empire at its height. It covered 13.7 million square miles, 63 times the size of the United Kingdom itself. And under Victoria, it grew and grew and grew, ultimately encompassing 458 million people, 1 in 4 humans alive. The sun never sets on the British Empire, people would say, and this wasn't poetic language, it was literal. At any given moment, at least one part of the empire was in daylight. The British Empire was basically history's most successful multinational corporation with a military wing that would make Blackwater blush. It started with trade, then added guns, then added flags. The East India Company, a private business with its own army, had controlled much of India since the 1750s. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which the British called the Mutiny and Indians would later call the First War of Independence, the British government took direct control. Did you hear? They're transferring India to the Crown, a London businessman tells his colleague over brandy at their club. Too important to be left to a trading company, apparently. Quite right, his friend replies, though I hear the company directors are being generously compensated. This was the Government of India Act of 1858, which dissolved the East India Company and transferred its territories and powers directly to the British Crown. 18 years later, Victoria would be proclaimed Empress of India, solidifying British control. What did all this actually mean for people living through it? Let me paint you a few scenes from across the empire. Imagine you're in Bombay, now Mumbai, in 1877. The city is sweltering under the pre-monsoon heat. Colonial buildings, imposing structures of stone and brick in European styles, stand alongside traditional Indian architecture. The streets are a riot of colour, sound and smell. Merchants calling their wares, sacred cows wandering freely, the aroma of spices mixing with less pleasant urban odours. At the Grand Bombay Durbar, a ceremonial gathering, British officials in formal attire, uncomfortably hot in their wool uniforms, proclaim Victoria as Empress of India. Local princes in magnificent jewels and fine silks are required to bow before a portrait of a woman they've never seen, who lives 4,500 miles away. British military bands play God Save the Queen while artillery fire thunderous salutes. The natives seem quite pleased with the new arrangement, a British officer's wife writes to her sister in Hampshire, though I doubt they truly understand the significance. This patronising attitude was typical. Most British in India viewed themselves as bringing civilization to what they considered a backward land, conveniently ignoring India's ancient cultural heritage, sophisticated artistic traditions, and complex religious systems. Let's jump across the empire to the Caribbean. In Jamaica, the 1870s are a time of continued hardship for the black population. Slavery had been abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833, but freedom hadn't brought equality or prosperity. Economic exploitation, racial discrimination, and political disenfranchisement remained the reality for most. My grandfather was a slave on this same plantation, an elderly Jamaican man tells his grandchildren as they cut sugarcane under the burning sun. Now I'm free, but still working the white man's land for pennies. Some things change, some don't. The plantation owner, a third-generation Englishman who has never visited Britain, lives in a grand house on a hill overlooking the fields. His income depends on cheap labour and preferential trade agreements with Britain. The empire was built on such economic relationships, extracting raw materials from colonies and selling manufactured goods back to captive markets. Now to Australia, where the indigenous Aboriginal population has been devastated by disease, violence and displacement since British colonisation began in 1788. By the 1870s, their numbers have been reduced by as much as 90% in some regions. Meanwhile, British settlers are establishing sheep stations, mining operations and cities across the continent. In Melbourne, a prosperous city built on the gold rush of the 1850s, a wealthy wool merchant sits on his veranda reading the latest news from London, which arrived by steamship 6 weeks after publication. They've made Her Majesty Empress of India, he tells his wife. Seems appropriate. The empire keeps growing. Perhaps we'll have all of Africa next. His prediction wasn't far off. The latter part of Victoria's reign saw the scramble for Africa, when European powers divided the continent among themselves with little regard for existing cultures, languages, or political systems. Britain took the lion's share, including Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, and more. Back in London, these far-flung territories were represented by exotic products flooding into British shops: tea from India, coffee from Jamaica, gold from Australia, ivory from Africa. The Great Exhibition of 1851 had showcased imperial treasures, and now ordinary British consumers could purchase goods from around the world. "Have you tried the new Ceylon tea?" a middle-class housewife asks her friend during a shopping trip. Much more delicate flavour than the Chinese variety, and supports our empire rather than the celestial kingdom. For the Victorian middle and upper classes, empire was largely experienced through consumer goods, investment opportunities, and a sense of national pride. The darker aspects, exploitation, cultural destruction, racial violence, were conveniently distant and easily ignored. But the empire wasn't just about economics. It was also driven by missionary zeal, both religious and cultural. Victorian Britain saw itself as bringing Christianity, civilization, and progress to backward peoples. This self-serving narrative justified conquest and exploitation while soothing potential moral qualms. "We have a duty to these people," declares a passionate young missionary at a church fundraising event in Yorkshire, "to bring them the light of Christ and rescue them from heathen darkness." His audience nods approvingly and reaches for their purses. Missionary societies raised enormous sums to send earnest young Britons around the world to convert indigenous populations. These missionaries often learned local languages, provided education and medical care, and sometimes advocated against the worst abuses of colonial rule. But they also undermined traditional cultures and religions and served as a vanguard for imperial expansion. Wait, I need to tell you about one of my favourite stories from the Victorian Empire, because it perfectly captures the bizarre contradictions of the whole enterprise. In 1876, the same year Victoria became Empress of India, British forces were fighting the Asante Empire in what's now Ghana. The British invaded, looted the Asante capital of Kumasi, and demanded a huge indemnity. When they left, they took with them the young Prince Kofi Karikari as a guest, read hostage to ensure payment. This teenage African prince was brought to England and in one of history's weird twists ended up being educated at a Quaker school where he became friends with the sons of missionaries. He later studied at an agricultural college and returned to Africa as an adult. This kind of thing happened constantly in the Victorian Empire, strange cultural collisions that produced unexpected outcomes. The empire wasn't just about Brits imposing their will on others, it was a complex web of exchanges, adaptations, resistances, and compromises. But the core reality was still fundamentally unequal power. British gunboats, rifles, and economic might meant they could generally get their way when they really wanted to. Victoria herself had complex views on the empire and its peoples. On one hand, she held many of the racial prejudices common in her era. On the other, she sometimes showed surprising openness to other cultures, particularly Indian. After becoming Empress of India, Victoria developed a genuine interest in Indian affairs and culture. She employed Indian servants at court, learned Urdu phrases, and even developed a close friendship with an Indian Muslim servant named Abdul Karim. The Queen has that Indian fellow serving her personally now, whispers a shocked lady-in-waiting to her colleague, and I hear she's taking language lessons from him. Abdul Karim came to England in 1887 as a gift from India to serve during Victoria's Golden Jubilee. He was originally just a waiter, but Victoria liked him and quickly promoted him to Munshi, teacher. He taught her Urdu, told her about Indian customs, and became one of her closest companions in her later years. The royal household was scandalized. Victoria's family, courtiers, and government officials were openly racist toward Karim and tried repeatedly to get rid of him. Victoria, stubborn as ever, defended him fiercely. The Queen Empress has commanded that her Indian secretary be treated with the same respect as her European attendants, reads an angry memo Victoria sent to her household. Victoria's interest in India went beyond Karim. She advocated for fair treatment of Indian princes, insisted on learning about Hindu and Muslim customs, and sometimes pushed back against the more extreme racist policies her government proposed. But these were modest countercurrents against the massive tide of imperial exploitation. For most subjects across the empire, Queen Victoria was an abstract figure, a face on a coin or a portrait in a government office. Few could reconcile the grandmotherly woman in her black widow's weeds with the enormous imperial machinery operating in her name. In India, the Raj, British rule, reorganised agriculture toward export crops, contributing to famines that killed millions. In Africa, arbitrary borders drawn by European diplomats divided ethnic groups and forced traditional enemies together, creating problems that would explode after independence. In Australia and Canada, Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in residential schools to civilise them, causing generational trauma. And yet the empire also built railways, schools, and hospitals. It spread the English language, which would become a global lingua franca. It established legal systems and bureaucracies that many post-colonial nations would maintain after independence. Like most historical phenomena, its legacy defies simple moral judgment. My uncle went out to India with nothing but his education, a young clerk tells his friend in a London pub. Now he's a district commissioner with a big house and 10 servants. Could never have that life here. The empire created opportunities for ambitious young Britons who couldn't find advancement at home, second sons who wouldn't inherit land, educated women with few prospects in Britain, working-class men with technical skills, all could find opportunities across the empire that were unavailable in the rigid class system at home. For these colonial administrators, soldiers, missionaries, teachers, nurses, and engineers, the empire was a chance to reinvent themselves. Many believed sincerely in their civilizing mission. Others were simply seeking fortune or adventure. All were participating in a system that fundamentally depended on inequality and exploitation, whether they acknowledged it or not. Back in London, Victoria was increasingly seen as the symbolic mother of this global imperial family. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and Diamond Jubilee in 1897 were imperial spectacles, with representatives from across the empire participating in elaborate parades and ceremonies. At the Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne, colonial troops from every part of the empire marched through London streets. Turbaned Sikhs, Maori warriors, Canadian Mounties, African soldiers, displaying the global reach of British power. "It's quite a sight," remarks an American visitor watching the parade, "though I wonder how long they can hold it all together." A fair question. By the late Victorian period, nationalism was already stirring in many colonies. In India, the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, beginning the long struggle for independence. In Ireland, Home Rule movements were gaining strength. The seeds of decolonisation were being planted even as the empire reached its territorial peak. Victoria herself would never see the empire's decline. When she died in 1901, British imperial confidence was still high despite challenges in the ongoing Boer War in South Africa. The full reckoning with empire's costs for both colonised and colonisers would come in the 20th century. For Victoria, the empire represented British greatness on the world stage. For her subjects in London or Liverpool, it meant exotic goods and national pride. For colonial officials in Bombay or Cairo, it meant power and status. For indigenous peoples in Australia or Canada, it meant displacement and cultural destruction. For Indian peasants or Caribbean workers, it meant economic exploitation under foreign masters. All these experiences were part of the Victorian Empire, a vast, contradictory global system that encompassed nearly a quarter of humanity by the time Victoria died. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, look around your room. Do you have cotton sheets, tea in your cupboard, a wooden bookshelf, chocolate in the kitchen? In Victoria's time, these common items were physical manifestations of empire. Cotton from Egypt or India, tea from Ceylon, mahogany from the Caribbean, cocoa from West Africa. The Victorian Empire has faded into history, but its legacies, good and ill, continue to shape our world today, from geopolitics and languages to the contents of your kitchen cabinet. And at the centre of this vast imperial web sat one small woman in perpetual mourning black, whose name would become synonymous with an age: Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, and after 1876, Empress of India. The carriage rattles to a stop at King's Cross Station, and you step out onto the bustling platform. The year is 1885. The massive iron and glass roof soars overhead, sunlight streaming through in diagonal shafts that cut through the steam and smoke. You've never seen so many people moving in so many directions. Porters push trolleys piled with luggage. Ladies in bustled dresses clutch their hat boxes. Businessmen check pocket watches and frown at the timetables. A group of schoolboys chase each other around an iron pillar while their harried teacher tries to count heads. And dominating it all, the trains, massive iron beasts hissing steam, their polished brass fittings gleaming. They're lined up at the platforms like impatient thoroughbreds, ready to thunder off to Edinburgh or York or Manchester or 100 other destinations. "All aboard for the 10:15 to Brighton," bellows a guard swinging his lamp. This, right here, is the beating heart of Victorian innovation. The railway. Nothing, not electricity, not factories, not even the telegraph, transformed life in the 19th century more completely than these iron roads and the steam engines that travelled them. First time in London, miss? Asks a porter, noting your wide-eyed amazement. The scale of it all is overwhelming. King's Cross Station itself is a monument to Victorian engineering confidence, a vast cathedral of transport with its enormous clock and timetables listing connections to places you've barely heard of. It's hard for us to comprehend how utterly the railways revolutionised human existence. For all of history, until the early 1800s, the fastest anyone could travel over land was the speed of a galloping horse, maybe 25 miles per hour at maximum, and not sustainable for long distances. Most people moved at walking pace, or if they were wealthy, in horse-drawn carriages at 10-12 miles per hour. Then suddenly, ordinary people could travel at 50, 60, even 70 miles per hour. Distances that once took days could be covered in hours. The world literally shrank. My grandfather rode the first passenger railway in 30, an elderly gentleman tells his wide-eyed grandson, as they wait for their train. The rocket they called the engine. People thought the speed would scramble your brains or make your blood boil. By the 1880s, such fears seem ludicrous. Britain has over 15,000 miles of railway track crisscrossing the country. You can board a train in London after breakfast and be in Edinburgh for dinner, a journey that would have taken at least 3 days by stagecoach a century earlier. Standardized time has been introduced across the country to make timetables work, replacing the local solar time that once had noon occurring at different moments in different towns. Mind the gap, sir, calls a platform attendant as a distracted businessman nearly steps into the space between platform and carriage. The railway has transformed not just travel, but the very geography of Britain. New towns have sprung up around railway junctions. Old market towns, bypassed by the lines, have withered. Seaside resorts like Brighton and Blackpool have boomed as day trippers and vacationers arrive by the trainload. You board your train, a third-class carriage, the most affordable option. The wooden bench is hard, but the compartment is clean and reasonably comfortable. First-class passengers enjoy upholstered seats, more space, and sometimes dining cars. Second class, increasingly being phased out by many railway companies, offers a middle ground. With a whistle and a lurch, the train pulls away from the station. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on track is hypnotic as London slides past the windows. Rows of identical brick houses, factories belching smoke, church spires, and then gradually green fields and hedgerows as you leave the city behind. A family shares your compartment. Parents with 3 children dressed in their Sunday best, clearly making a special journey. The youngest boy can't contain his excitement, bouncing on the seat and pressing his face against the window. "It's my first time on a train," he confides breathlessly. "We're going to visit my aunt in Oxford. Father says it's 60 miles and we'll be there in less than 2 hours. His mother smiles apologetically, but you don't mind the child's enthusiasm. It's a reminder of how miraculous this mode of transport still seems, even as it becomes commonplace. The railways didn't just move people, they moved goods, information, and ideas. Fresh milk and produce could reach cities from the countryside before spoiling. Newspapers printed in London in the morning could be read in Manchester by afternoon. Mail delivery, once weekly at best in remote areas, became a daily service. "Did you see the latest about that Edison fellow?" a businessman asks his colleague across the aisle, folding his newspaper. "Says he's working on a moving picture machine now. First the phonograph, then the electric light, now this. Americans and their gadgets." Thomas Edison is just one of many inventors whose work is transforming daily life in the late Victorian period. The pace of technological change is dizzying, almost as rapid as our own time, but starting from a much more primitive baseline. In a single lifetime, a person might witness the introduction of railways, photography, telegraphy, telephones, electric lighting, automobiles, and more. Your journey continues, the countryside rolling past in a green blur. Villages appear and vanish, church spires mark the centre of small towns. Occasionally, the shadow of a railway bridge momentarily darkens the carriage, 2 hours that would once have been a full day's travel by coach. When you disembark at your destination, another Victorian marvel awaits: the telegraph office. A small, unassuming building with a sign reading "Messages transmitted to all parts of the world." Inside, a clerk sits behind a counter, a Morse key at his fingertips. On the wall behind him, a map shows telegraph lines spanning continents and even oceans, thanks to submarine cables laid across the Atlantic and other waters. "I'd like to send a message to London," says a woman ahead of you in line. "To my husband, just to let him know I've arrived safely." The clerk nods, pulls out a form, and hands her a pencil. 20 words for a shilling, ma'am, each additional word tuppence. The telegraph, invented in the 1830s and widespread by the 1850s, was the Victorian internet. For the first time in human history, messages could travel faster than a physical messenger could carry them. News that once took weeks or months to spread could now circulate globally in hours. When Queen Victoria's husband Albert died in 1861, the news reached distant parts of the empire via telegraph almost immediately. During the Indian Rebellion of 1857, telegraph operators had played a crucial role, warning of approaching rebels and coordinating the British military response. The last message from one besieged station reportedly read simply, "The sepoys are coming. We are," before falling silent. "Just sent a wire to my broker in the city," a prosperous-looking gentleman tells his companion as they leave the office. "South African mining stocks are falling. Told him to sell before we lose everything." The telegraph transformed business as much as personal communication. Stock prices, commodity values, and market information could be transmitted instantly, creating truly global markets for the first time. Standardized codes were developed to reduce the number of words needed, saving money on telegrams while maintaining security. You continue your journey through town, and as dusk falls, you witness another Victorian wonder: electric street lighting. Arc lamps sputter and glow with a harsh blue-white brilliance, turning night into an approximation of day. Not all streets have them yet. Gas lighting still predominates, but the electric lights represent the cutting edge of 1880s urban infrastructure. "They're putting them in all along the high street next month," a shopkeeper tells a customer as they watch a lamplighter at work on a traditional gas lamp. "Council says it's safer and cleaner. No more gas leaks or fire risk. Progress, I suppose, though I'll miss the warmer light." The debate between gas and electric lighting raged through the late Victorian period. Gas companies had invested heavily in infrastructure and fought to maintain their dominance. Electric lighting was initially expensive and unreliable, but its advantages — no smell, no heat, no risk of asphyxiation, no open flame — gradually won out. In homes, the transition was slower. By the 1880s, wealthy households might have a few electric lights in public rooms while continuing to use gas or oil lamps elsewhere. Middle-class homes were just beginning to consider electric installation, often starting with a single light in the parlour as a status symbol. Working-class families still relied primarily on candles and oil lamps. You find lodging for the night at a moderately priced hotel that proudly advertises electric bell in every room. Not electric lighting, but an electric call button to summon service. Small innovations were often adopted before larger systems changed. The next morning after breakfast, you set out to explore further. Your destination? A telephone exchange, one of the newest technological marvels of the 1880s. The telephone, patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, was still a rarity in Britain. By 1881, London had only about 750 telephone subscribers. The instruments themselves were cumbersome, separate mouthpiece and earpiece, with a hand crank to generate a ringing current. "National Telephone Company," announces the receptionist as you enter the exchange building. "Do you wish to place a call?" Behind her, a room full of young women, telephone operators, sit before a massive switchboard connecting calls by physically plugging cables into the appropriate sockets. Their dexterity is remarkable as they juggle multiple connections, speaking clearly and precisely into their mouthpieces. "Number, please," you hear them repeating as they work. "Most of our subscribers are businesses," the receptionist explains when you inquire. "Law firms, newspaper offices, factories, a few wealthy private homes. Dr. Campbell has one installed at his surgery so patients can make appointments without travelling. Quite revolutionary." The telephone was initially viewed as a business tool rather than a social one. Early marketing emphasized its practical uses, summoning a doctor in emergencies, conducting business transactions, coordinating deliveries. The idea of using it for casual conversation seemed frivolous to many Victorians. "My wife wants one in our home," confides a businessman waiting to place a call. "Says she could chat with her sister across town without having to pay a call in person. I told her that's what servants and calling cards are for. Besides, who wants those unsightly wires running into one's home?" Aesthetics were a genuine concern in Victorian adoption of new technologies. Telephones, electric lights, and other innovations often clashed with Victorian decorative sensibilities, which favoured ornate covered surfaces. Manufacturers quickly learned to disguise technological intrusions, hiding telephone components in wooden cabinets carved to match existing furniture, designing light fixtures that resembled gas lamps, and creating electric kettles that looked like traditional stovetop models. Leaving the telephone exchange, you pass a photographer's studio. Photography, invented in the 1830s, had by the 1880s become accessible to the middle classes. The complicated daguerreotype process had given way to simpler methods using dry plate negatives, reducing both cost and exposure time. "Family portrait, miss," calls the photographer from his doorway. "Latest techniques. No need to hold still for more than a moment. Results guaranteed." Inside, examples of his work line the walls, solemn Victorian families arranged in rigid groupings, individual portraits of stern-looking gentlemen and demure ladies, occasional smiling children, though smiling in photographs was still uncommon, partly due to longer exposure times in earlier decades and partly due to Victorian formality. Photography had democratized portraiture, previously available only to those wealthy enough to commission a painter. By the 1880s, a middle-class family might have several photographs displayed in their home. Wedding portraits, baby pictures, family groups. Working-class families might save for a single treasured photograph to mark a special occasion. "My daughter's wedding next month," explains a woman discussing arrangements with the photographer. "We want a large print for the parlour and small cards to distribute to family." Carte de visite, small photographic calling cards, had been popular since the 1860s. People collected and exchanged them, displaying friends' and families' cards in special albums. Celebrities sold their photographic cards, creating the first modern form of fan merchandise. Queen Victoria herself was an enthusiastic photographer, maintaining detailed albums of her family. You continue your exploration of Victorian innovation with a visit to a large department store, another relatively recent development in retail. Inside, electric lights illuminate displays of consumer goods from across the empire and beyond. The abundance and variety are staggering compared to the small, specialized shops that dominated retail in earlier decades. "We've just received the new Singer sewing machines," a saleswoman tells a customer. "Much easier to operate than the previous model. Every modern household should have one." The sewing machine, patented in its modern form in the 1840s and mass-produced by the 1850s, had transformed both commercial clothing manufacturing and home sewing. Ready-made clothing became more available and affordable, while home seamstresses could produce garments much more quickly than by hand. "My wife completed a dress in 2 days that would have taken weeks before," enthuses a man examining the latest model. "Saves money too. No need for a seamstress for basic items." Throughout the store, other technological innovations designed for domestic use are on display. Carpet sweepers, precursors to vacuum cleaners, mechanical egg beaters, improved cooking stoves, washing mangles, and more. The late Victorian period saw an explosion in labour-saving devices aimed primarily at middle-class households. "This new gas cooker gives precise temperature control," demonstrates a salesman to a skeptical housewife. "No more burnt Sunday roasts." For the wealthy, these innovations meant greater convenience and often reduced staff requirements. For the middle classes, they offered the possibility of comfortable domestic life with fewer or no servants. For the working classes, many remained out of reach, though their manufacturing created jobs in factories and workshops. As evening approaches, you make your way to another marvel of Victorian engineering. The London Underground, the world's first underground railway, opened in 1863. By the 1880s, several lines operate beneath the streets of London, powered initially by steam locomotives and gradually transitioning to electric traction. Descending the stairs to the platform, the distinctive smell hits you, a mixture of coal smoke, steam, dust, and humanity. Despite ventilation shafts built into the tunnels, the atmosphere is thick and somewhat oppressive. Passengers crowd the platform, remarkably diverse in class and occupation. A democratic space in class-conscious Victorian society. "Mind your step," calls a guard as a train pulls into the station, brakes squealing against iron wheels. The carriages are lit with gas lamps, making them bright islands in the tunnel darkness. You board along with the evening crowd, office workers heading home, shop girls finished with their long shifts, theatre-goers dressed for an evening's entertainment. "Used to be terrified of these underground trains," an elderly woman confides to her companion. "Thought the tunnels would collapse or we'd suffocate from the smoke. Now I take it weekly to visit my daughter in Paddington. Couldn't manage the distance otherwise at my age." The Underground transformed London, allowing the city to expand outward, while workers could still commute to central locations. New suburbs grew around outlying stations, creating the first true commuter communities. Social patterns shifted as people could live miles from their workplaces. Your underground journey takes you to a music hall, another Victorian innovation, not technological but cultural. These entertainment venues offered variety shows for ordinary people at affordable prices. Inside, the hall is rowdy and vibrant. Acts include singers, comedians, acrobats, and novelty performances. Between scheduled acts, a man demonstrates Edison's phonograph, a device for recording and reproducing sound, first patented in 1877. You can hear the voice of someone miles away or someone who died years ago, he proclaims as the audience listens in wonder to the scratchy but recognizable reproduction of a popular song. The phonograph was one of many innovations that recorded or preserved aspects of reality previously ephemeral. Photography captured images, the phonograph captured sound, and another invention, not yet perfected but much discussed, promised to capture motion. They're working on moving photographs now, an enthusiastic young man tells his friends during the intermission. Imagine seeing a train coming right at you or waves breaking on a shore all on a screen. The earliest moving picture technologies were beginning to emerge in the 1880s, though commercial cinema was still years away. Devices like the zoetrope and praxinoscope created the illusion of movement through rapidly changing still images. Edison was working on his kinetoscope, while the Lumière brothers in France were developing their cinematograph. As the evening ends and you return to your lodgings, you reflect on the dizzying pace of change in this late Victorian world. A person born in 1820 who lived to the 1880s would have seen transportation transformed from horse-drawn coaches to steam railways, underground trains, and the earliest automobiles. Communication evolved from handwritten letters that took days or weeks to deliver, to telegraphs transmitting messages in minutes, to telephones allowing instantaneous voice conversation. Lighting progressed from candles to gas to electricity. Photography, sound recording, and the beginnings of moving pictures all emerged. For many Victorians, this rapid technological change inspired both excitement and anxiety. Literature of the period reflects both perspectives, celebrating human ingenuity while warning of potential dangers. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, had established the template for cautionary tales about technology outpacing moral considerations. G. Wells, whose The Time Machine was published in 1895, would become a master of speculative fiction that explored technology's possibilities and perils. "My father still refuses to have electricity in the house," a young woman tells her friend as they prepare for bed in your boarding house. "Says it's unnatural and dangerous, but I think it's wonderful. Clean light at the touch of a button, no more trimming wicks or cleaning lamp chimneys." Her friend nods. "My brother works for the telephone company. Says in 20 years every house will have a telephone and electric lights." Imagine that. Indeed, the innovations that seemed miraculous or frightening to Victorians would become commonplace to their children and grandchildren. The technological groundwork laid during Victoria's reign in transportation, communication, manufacturing, and household technology created the foundation for the modern world. As you drift off to sleep, the distant whistle of a steam train mingles with the occasional clop of horse hooves on cobblestones outside your window, the old and new coexisting in that transitional moment that was the late Victorian age. The world was changing faster than at any previous time in human history, creating possibilities that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. And at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the ageing Queen Victoria, who had seen her realm transformed from a primarily agricultural society to an industrial and technological powerhouse, dictated letters by lamplight, having never fully embraced electric lighting in her private rooms. Like many of her subjects, she straddled two worlds, the traditional past and the innovative future, as the century named after her drew to a close. Snow falls gently outside the bay window of the Thompson family home in December 1890. Inside, a fire crackles in the grate, casting warm light across the crowded but cosy parlour. Mrs. Thompson adjusts a strand of holly on the mantelpiece while her husband reads the newspaper in his armchair. Their 3 children sit on the rug playing with a wooden train set, a treasured Christmas gift from the previous year. This scene, the quintessential Victorian Christmas, would have been completely unrecognisable to Britons just 60 years earlier. Before Victoria's reign, Christmas was a minor holiday, often marked with church attendance and perhaps a special meal, but nothing like the elaborate celebration it would become. "I think we'll put the tree in front of the window this year," Mrs. Thompson says, glancing around the parlour. "The neighbours will be able to see it when they pass." The Christmas tree, that cornerstone of modern holiday celebrations, was largely unknown in Britain until Victoria and Albert popularised it. Albert brought the tradition from his native Germany, and when the Illustrated London News published an engraving of the royal family, gathered around their decorated tree in 1848, a new tradition was born. By the 1890s, Christmas trees were a must-have for middle-class families. "Can we decorate it tonight, Mama?" asks 8-year-old Emily, looking up from her toys. "I've been practicing Silent Night to sing when we light the candles." "Perhaps tomorrow, dear. Your father needs to bring it home from Mr. Wilson's shop first." Early Victorian Christmas trees were typically small tabletop affairs decorated with candles, sweets, fruits, and handmade ornaments. By the 1890s, they'd grown larger and more elaborate, often reaching from floor to ceiling and adorned with manufactured glass ornaments imported from Germany. Though lit candles remained the standard decoration, a fire hazard that caused many a Victorian Christmas to end dramatically. Christmas cards, another Victorian innovation, sit on the mantelpiece alongside the holly. The first commercial Christmas card was produced in 1843, the same year Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol. By the end of the century, sending and receiving cards had become a major part of the holiday season, with elaborate designs featuring robins, snow scenes, flowers, and cherubic children. "Mrs. Pemberton sent us a lovely card this year," Mrs. Thompson remarks, picking up a heavily embossed creation featuring angels and golden bells. "Much nicer than last year's. I wonder if they've come into money." This casual social reconnaissance through Christmas cards was part of the complex web of Victorian middle-class relationships. Every detail, the quality of a card when it arrived, how it was signed, carried social significance to those fluent in the unwritten rules of Victorian etiquette. The Thompson home itself is a perfect example of middle-class Victorian domestic ideals. The semi-detached house in a respectable suburb features that Victorian innovation, distinct rooms for distinct purposes. The front parlour, where we find the family this evening, is reserved for receiving visitors and family gatherings. A back parlour serves as a dining room. Upstairs are bedrooms and a small bathroom with running water, a luxury still not universal in the 1890s. Every inch of space is filled with furniture and decorative objects. Bare surfaces were considered unattractive in Victorian design. The parlour contains a piano, multiple armchairs and side tables, a chaise lounge, several standing lamps, multiple framed photographs and prints, potted plants, decorative plates, figurines, embroidered cushions, a large carpet, heavy drapes and wallpaper featuring an elaborate repeating pattern. To modernise, it would seem cluttered and overstuffed. To Victorians, it represented comfort, prosperity and good taste. "Papa, will we have roast goose for Christmas dinner?" asks 10-year-old William, setting aside a toy soldier. "I believe your mother has ordered one from the butcher," Mr. Thompson answers, lowering his newspaper, "along with all the proper trimmings." The proper trimmings for a Victorian Christmas dinner were extensive. Roast potatoes, parsnips, Brussels sprouts, carrots, cranberry sauce, bread sauce, stuffing, and the grand finale, Christmas pudding, ideally made weeks in advance and doused in brandy before being ceremonially set alight. This elaborate Christmas celebration, with its trees, cards, carols, gifts, and feasting, was largely a Victorian creation, a domestic ritual centered around children and family togetherness. It reflected the Victorian elevation of home as a sacred space and childhood as a special, protected time of life. "Emily, come here and let me fix your hair before bedtime," Mrs. Thompson calls, setting aside her needlework. "You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards." The child obediently crosses to her mother, who begins rebraiding her long brown hair. This simple interaction demonstrates the gender roles that structured Victorian family life. Mrs. Thompson, like most middle-class Victorian women, centres her life around the home and children. Mr. Thompson, like most men, works in the public sphere, in his case as a bank clerk, but sees the home as his castle, a retreat from the competitive business world. "I saw the most distressing sight on my way home from work," Mr. Thompson remarks, folding his newspaper. "A group of street children begging near the station. In this weather too, no proper coats or shoes." Child poverty remained a harsh reality in the 1890s, despite decades of social reforms. The contrast between the protected childhoods of middle-class families like the Thompsons and the harsh experiences of poor children was stark. In wealthy homes, childhood was increasingly viewed as a special time requiring nurturing, education, and play. Working-class children might still labour in factories, mines or shops, though child labour laws had improved conditions somewhat since earlier in the century. "Perhaps we should make a donation to Dr. Barnardo's orphanage," Mrs. Thompson suggests, referring to one of the many Victorian charities established to help destitute children. As part of our Christmas giving, charitable giving was considered a moral duty for respectable Victorian families, especially at Christmas. The influence of Dickens's A Christmas Carol, with its themes of generosity and redemption, had helped establish the holiday as a time for remembering the less fortunate. "An excellent idea, my dear. William, Emily, you should each set aside a portion of your pocket money as well. It will teach you the importance of helping those less fortunate." Victorian moral education emphasized duty, self-discipline, and character development. Children were expected to learn these values through both instruction and practice, with parents serving as the primary moral guides. "Now, children, time for bed. You may each choose one story before prayers." The Thompsons, like many Victorian families, practiced daily family prayers alongside regular church attendance. Religious observance was woven into the fabric of daily life, with morning and evening prayers, grace before meals, and Sunday as a day reserved for worship and quiet activities. As the children select their books from the small family library, we glimpse another aspect of Victorian home life, the importance of reading as both entertainment and moral instruction. Books considered suitable for children had expanded dramatically during Victoria's reign, evolving from overtly didactic religious tracts to include adventure stories, fairy tales, and novels written specifically for young readers. "I want Alice in Wonderland," Emily declares, pulling the volume from the shelf, "and I'll have Treasure Island," William adds, selecting his own favourite. These choices reflect the golden age of children's literature that flourished in Victorian Britain. Lewis Carroll, Robert Louis Stevenson, E. Nesbit, and many others created works that continue to be read today. For Victorian families who could afford books, reading aloud was a common evening entertainment that brought the family together. After the children have gone upstairs, accompanied by Mrs. Thompson for their bedtime routine, Mr. Thompson sits alone in the parlour, enjoying a quiet pipe, another common Victorian ritual. He contemplates the stack of Christmas gifts hidden in his study, waiting to be wrapped and placed under the tree on Christmas Eve. The Victorian gift-giving tradition had evolved substantially over the century. Early Victorian Christmas gifts were typically small, often handmade items, carved wooden toys, embroidered handkerchiefs, preserved fruits or nuts and candies. By the 1890s, the consumer revolution had transformed gift-giving into something more recognizable to modern eyes. Manufactured toys, books, clothing, and decorative items purchased from shops and department stores. "I hope Emily likes the doll's house," he murmurs to himself. "Took half my Christmas bonus." The elaborate doll's house, ordered months ago from a specialty shop, represents the increasingly child-centered nature of Victorian Christmas. Children who earlier in the century might have received an orange and a wooden toy now received multiple gifts, often including complicated mechanical toys, books, games, and clothing. Mrs. Thompson returns downstairs after settling the children. "They're saying their prayers now," she informs her husband. "Charlotte is with baby Anne." Charlotte is the family's nursemaid, one of two servants in this middle-class household. The other, a cook housemaid named Martha, has already retired to her small room at the top of the house. "I need to finish addressing the cards tomorrow," Mrs. Thompson continues, returning to her chair and picking up her needlework, "and we must decide which charity dinners to attend. The Wilsons have invited us for the 27th, and my sister wants us for New Year's Day." The social calendar of a Victorian family during the Christmas season was busy with obligations, church services, charity events, family gatherings, and social calls. The period between Christmas and Twelfth Night, January 6th, was filled with visiting and entertaining, particularly for the middle and upper classes. "I've invited my colleague Harrison and his wife for dinner on the 23rd, Mr. Thompson adds. "He's been very helpful with the Westmoreland account." "I'll speak to Martha about the menu tomorrow," Mrs. Thompson replies, mentally calculating what food would be appropriate for a business associate of her husband's rank. This casual exchange reveals the complex social calculations that governed Victorian entertaining. The food served, the table setting, the timing of the invitation, all communicated specific messages about social status and relationships. Mrs. Thompson, like most Victorian wives, was responsible for maintaining these social connections that could be crucial to her husband's professional advancement. As the evening grows later, Mr. Thompson checks his pocket watch. "Nearly 10. Shall we retire?" The daily rhythms of Victorian family life were more structured than in our era. Mealtimes were regular and formal, even in modest households. Bedtimes were adhered to strictly. Daily activities followed predictable patterns: work for the men, household management for the women, lessons and limited playtime for the children. Upstairs in the children's rooms, we see more evidence of the Victorian attitude toward childhood. William's room contains a small desk for schoolwork, bookshelves filled with improving literature and adventure stories, collections of rocks and bird eggs, and toy soldiers arranged in battle formations. The walls are decorated with maps and prints of historical scenes. His school uniform hangs ready for the next term. Emily's room reflects different expectations for girls. Her books tend toward moral tales and domestic stories. Her toys include dolls, a miniature tea set, and simple craft materials. A sampler displaying her needlework hangs on the wall, evidence of the domestic skills considered essential for girls. On her small desk lies schoolwork that includes French vocabulary, music practice notes, and basic arithmetic. Both rooms would be considered Spartan by modern standards. Victorian parenting emphasized character development through discipline, including physical comfort. Bedrooms were kept cool, believing fresh air, even cold air, was healthier than warmth. Beds were hard, often with horsehair mattresses. Children were expected to keep their rooms tidy and to rise early regardless of the season. In the nursery, Baby Anne sleeps in an elaborate wooden crib, carefully monitored by Charlotte, the nursemaid. Middle-class Victorian mothers typically employed nursemaids for infant care, though changing attitudes toward motherhood meant they were more involved than aristocratic mothers of previous generations. Anne will remain primarily in the nursery until she's old enough to join family meals and activities, usually around age 4. This separation of children by age was characteristic of Victorian child rearing. Babies and toddlers belonged in the nursery. Older children increasingly participated in family life while receiving education appropriate to their gender, and adolescence began preparation for adult roles, university or profession for boys, domestic and social skills for girls. Back downstairs, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson complete their evening routine. The fire is banked to last through the night, the parlour is tidied, the house is locked and checked, gas lights are extinguished except for a single flame kept burning in the hallway for safety. In the master bedroom, Mrs. Thompson removes the numerous pins from her hair, letting it fall down her back as she sits at her dressing table. The elaborate hairstyle that appears so effortless in public requires considerable time and skill to create each morning. She removes her jewellery, placing it carefully in a decorative box, a gift from her husband on their 10th anniversary. Mr. Thompson winds his pocket watch and places it on his bedside table. The routine is comfortable, established through years of marriage. Even in the private space of their bedroom, Victorian propriety is maintained. Nightclothes are modest and fully covering. Personal toilette is conducted with discretion. Despite the stereotype of Victorian prudishness, evidence from letters and diaries suggests many Victorian marriages included genuine affection and physical intimacy. Queen Victoria herself, in letters to her eldest daughter, described physical aspects of marriage as a blessed part of the relationship when based on love. I spoke with Dr. Jenkins today about Anne's cough, Mrs. Thompson mentions as she brushes her hair. He says it's nothing to worry about, just the damp weather. Good. Children are so susceptible in winter. This casual mention reflects a constant background worry in Victorian family life, childhood illness. Even in prosperous families like the Thompsons, diseases that are minor inconveniences today could become life-threatening. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, these and other illnesses regularly claimed young lives across all social classes. Mrs. Parker's youngest died of diphtheria last week, Mrs. Thompson continues soberly. Their third child lost in 5 years. I can't imagine the grief. Child mortality, while improved from earlier decades, remained significantly higher than modern rates. Victorian culture developed elaborate mourning rituals, partly in response to this reality. The death of a child was a common experience, but never considered minor. Families kept locks of hair, posthumous photographs, and tiny personal items as mementos of deceased children. "We are fortunate indeed," Mr. Thompson responds, looking out the window at the continuing snowfall. 3 healthy children, a comfortable home, sufficient income. Many would envy our situation. This attitude, a combination of gratitude, religious faith and stoicism, characterized much of Victorian middle-class outlook. Life contained hardships and uncertainties, but proper behaviour, hard work and moral living would be rewarded, if not always in this world, then certainly in the next. As the Thompsons prepare for sleep, other households across Victorian Britain are completing their own evening routines, each according to their class and circumstances. In a grand country house, aristocratic family members retire after an evening of music and cards, attended by ladies' maids and valets who will prepare them for bed, turn down their sheets and ensure their comfort. In a small rural cottage, a farming family banks the fire that provides both heat and cooking facilities, checks on livestock one final time, and retires to bed early to be ready for pre-dawn chores. In London's East End, a working-class mother settles multiple children into shared beds in a two-room apartment while her husband returns from a late shift at the docks. In a wealthy merchant's mansion, the lady of the house reviews household accounts and menus with her housekeeper before retiring, while downstairs, servants finish cleaning the kitchen and preparing for morning duties. These diverse households share certain commonalities despite their differences. The Victorian home, whether mansion or cottage, was idealised as a haven from the outside world, a moral space centred on family bonds. The actual experience varied widely based on class, income, location, and individual circumstances, but the ideal shaped everything from architecture to social expectations. For the Thompsons, like many middle-class Victorian families, home represented not just shelter, but identity. Their furnishings, decorations, routines, and relationships all communicated who they were, or aspired to be, within the complex social hierarchy of Victorian Britain. As sleep claims the Thompson household, the snow continues to fall, muffling the sounds of the city and transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. Tomorrow will bring more Christmas preparations, more social obligations, more work and play and prayer, the rhythms of Victorian family life that would be both recognisable and strange to us, their future observers. London, June 22nd, 1897. The greatest street party in history. Imagine yourself standing among the crowds, millions of people packed shoulder to shoulder along the 6-mile procession route. The streets have been decorated with flags, bunting, and flowers. Grandstands erected for the occasion are filled with dignitaries from across the globe. Regular folks have been camped out for days to secure a good viewing spot. The air buzzes with anticipation. People who would normally never speak to each other, lords and labourers, shop girls and society matrons, find themselves sharing space and excitement. "Is that her? Is she coming?" a small boy asks, tugging at his father's sleeve. "Not yet, lad, but soon." The Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years of Victoria's reign, is a celebration unlike anything Britain has ever seen. It's part imperial spectacle, part national thanksgiving, part popular festival. It's also a moment for reflection on how profoundly the world has changed during this one woman's lifetime on the throne. "My grandfather saw her coronation," an elderly man tells the strangers standing near him. "Said she was just a slip of a girl, nervous as anything. Now look, she's ruled longer than any monarch in our history." A distant roar erupts from further down the route. The procession is approaching. First come military detachments from across the empire, turbaned Sikhs from India, Maori warriors from New Zealand, mounted Canadian police in scarlet tunics, African colonial troops, Australian cavalry. The crowd cheers each group, this living display of Britain's global reach. Then more cheering as colonial prime ministers pass by in open carriages, followed by princes and princesses of the royal family in their finest military uniforms and gowns. And finally, the moment everyone has been waiting for, a gap in the procession, then the royal carriage appears, drawn by 8 cream-coloured horses. Inside sits Queen Victoria herself, now 78 years old, dressed in black as always, but with a bonnet of white ostrich feathers for the occasion. "God bless you, ma'am," someone shouts, and the cry is taken up along the route. "God bless the Queen." Victoria is deeply moved. Unlike her golden jubilee 10 years earlier, she's instructed her carriage to move slowly so the people can see her clearly. She nods and waves, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She looks well for her age," a woman remarks. "Hard to believe she was born when Napoleon was still alive." That's the thing about Victoria. Her life spanned such an extraordinary period of change that she seemed to bridge multiple historical eras. Born when travel still meant horses and communication meant handwritten letters, she would live to see automobiles and telephones, electric lights and moving pictures. From the age of sail to the age of steam and beyond. The procession continues to St. Paul's Cathedral, where Victoria remains in her carriage for the Thanksgiving service, unable to manage the steps due to her arthritis. The Archbishop and clergy come outside to conduct the service in the open air instead, a practical compromise that endears the elderly Queen to her subjects even more. "She's a game old bird," a Cockney fruit seller tells his neighbour admiringly. "Won't let age stop her." Indeed, Victoria has become something of a paradox in her old age, simultaneously a symbol of tradition and continuity while presiding over a period of unprecedented change. The tiny, round figure in perpetual mourning black has somehow become the personification of the most powerful nation on earth. After the ceremony, Victoria returns to Buckingham Palace, watching from the balcony as countless thousands cheer below. That evening, bonfires are lit across the country, from hilltops in Scotland to the cliffs of Dover. Special Diamond Jubilee beacons create a network of light visible for miles, a fitting symbol for the empire on which the sun never sets. But behind the grand public spectacle, the reality of Victoria's final years was more subdued. After the Jubilee celebrations, she returned to the quiet routine that had characterised her later life, dividing her time between Windsor, Balmoral in Scotland, and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The Queen looked tired at dinner tonight, her lady-in-waiting confides to the court physician after a particularly long day of duties. "I worry about her doing too much at her age." "Her Majesty is remarkably strong for her years," the doctor replies, "but yes, she should rest more than she does." Victoria, however, had never been one to avoid duty. Even in her 80s, she continued to read state papers daily, meet with ministers, write in her journal, and correspond with her vast family network spread across the thrones of Europe. Let me tell you about Victoria's daily life in these final years because it's so different from the pomp and circumstance of occasions like the Jubilee. A typical day for the elderly Queen began around 7:30 a.m. when her Indian servant Abdul Karim would bring her a light breakfast. She would read and respond to some correspondence, then dress with the help of her ladies-in-waiting. Despite her wealth and status, Victoria's personal habits were relatively simple. She preferred plain food, moderate warmth, keeping rooms cooler than most people found comfortable, and fresh air. Late mornings might include official papers or meetings, followed by lunch, often with family members or visiting dignitaries. Afternoons, weather permitting, involved a drive in an open carriage, a practice she maintained into her final years. Victoria loved being outdoors and insisted on daily airings regardless of weather. Her ladies-in-waiting sometimes suffered through these excursions in driving rain or bitter cold, while the Queen remained impervious to the elements. "The Queen says we'll drive to Frogmore this afternoon," sighs a shivering lady-in-waiting, looking out at the January drizzle. "She wants to visit the Prince Consort's mausoleum again. Better wear 2 shawls, her colleague advises. "Last time my teeth were chattering so loudly I thought they'd fall out." Even in her 80s, Victoria visited Albert's tomb regularly, a testament to the devotion that had shaped her life and reign. After Albert's death in 1861, many had feared Victoria would never recover from her grief. In a sense, they were right. She never stopped mourning him. But she'd gradually learned to carry her grief while continuing her duties, creating a model of widowhood that many Victorian women emulated. Evenings at court were quiet affairs, dinner with family or courtiers, perhaps some music or reading aloud afterward. Victoria retired early by aristocratic standards, usually by 10:30 p.m. Her ladies would help her undress and prepare for bed, and she would read or write in her journal before sleeping. This routine varied with the seasons and locations. At Balmoral, her beloved Scottish estate, she enjoyed more relaxed Highland customs and the company of John Brown until his death in 1883, and then other trusted Scottish servants. At Osborne House, she could enjoy relative privacy away from official duties. As the 19th century drew to a close, Victoria remained mentally sharp but physically frail. Her eyesight was failing, making reading and writing difficult. She used a wheelchair frequently, though she insisted on standing for certain ceremonial occasions through sheer force of will. "I'm not as young as I was," she remarked to her daughter Beatrice after a particularly tiring day of duties in the summer of 1900. It was a rare admission of vulnerability from a woman who had spent her life projecting strength. The world around her was changing rapidly. The first automobiles appeared on British roads in the 1890s, though Victoria herself never rode in one. Electric lighting had replaced gas in many homes and businesses. The first cinema films were being shown. Women were beginning to demand the vote, though Victoria herself opposed female suffrage as a mad, wicked folly. Victoria's own family had grown enormously. 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and an increasing number of great-grandchildren. Her descendants sat on thrones across Europe, earning her the nickname the Grandmother of Europe. Yet family life brought sorrows as well as joys in her final years. In 1892, her grandson Prince Albert Victor, second in line to the throne, died of influenza at age 28. In 1900, her second son Alfred died of throat cancer. That same year, her favourite grandson, Prince Christian Victor, died of typhoid while serving in the Boer War in South Africa. "So much death," Victoria wrote in her journal. "I feel I am soon to join them." The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, cast a shadow over Victoria's final years. This conflict between Britain and the Boer republics in South Africa proved far more difficult than expected, revealing weaknesses in the British military and dividing public opinion. Victoria took a keen interest in the war, sending chocolate gifts to troops and visiting wounded soldiers. "The Queen asked me about conditions in South Africa," a bandaged officer tells his hospital roommate after Victoria visited the military hospital. "Knew all the regiments, all the battles, sharp as a tack despite her age." As 1900 turned to 1901, Victoria's health began to deteriorate noticeably. In December 1900, she celebrated her last Christmas at Osborne House, surrounded by family. By January, she was experiencing episodes of confusion and weakness. On January 17th, 1901, it became clear that the Queen was seriously ill. Her family was summoned. Her son and heir, Bertie, the future Edward VII, rushed to her bedside, as did her eldest grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. "I think I am dying," she told her doctors on January 21st. The next day, January 22nd, 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House, surrounded by her family. She was 81 years old and had ruled for 63 years, 7 months and 2 days, the longest reign of any British monarch until Queen Elizabeth II surpassed her record in 2015. Victoria had left detailed instructions for her funeral. She wanted to be dressed in white, not her customary black, with her wedding veil. She asked for Albert's dressing gown and a cast of his hand to be placed in her coffin, along with numerous mementos of her family. Secretly, she also requested that a lock of John Brown's hair, his photograph, and some of his letters be buried with her. requests that her family discovered only after her death and reluctantly honoured. The Queen's funeral on February 2nd, 1901 marked the end of an era in more ways than one. As her coffin processed through the streets of London, many in the crowds wept openly. Few could remember a time before Victoria. For most of her subjects, she had always been there, a constant in a rapidly changing world. "It's like losing a grandmother," one woman told a newspaper reporter. "Even if you never met her, she was always part of your life." Victoria was buried beside Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, finally reunited with the husband whose loss had defined the second half of her reign. The world Victoria left behind in 1901 was dramatically different from the one she had inherited in 1837. Britain had transformed from a primarily agricultural nation to the world's leading industrial and imperial power. The population had more than doubled. Cities had expanded enormously. Technology had revolutionized daily life. Social reforms had improved conditions for many, though poverty and inequality remained. Victoria's son and heir, now King Edward VII, represented a sharp break from his mother's style. Where she had been dutiful and morally strict, he was sociable and pleasure-loving. Where she had preferred seclusion, he embraced public appearances and lavish entertaining. The Edwardian era that followed would be characterized by a certain gilded exuberance, the last flourish of aristocratic excess before World War I changed everything. But Victoria's influence remained. The moral values associated with her reign, family focus, work ethic, charitable involvement and public service, continued to shape British society long after her death. Victorian architecture still dominated cities and towns. Victorian literature still filled bookshelves. Victorian infrastructure, sewers, railways, buildings remained the backbone of daily life. More subtly, Victorian innovations in governance, civil service, education and public health had created frameworks that would evolve into the modern welfare state. The seeds of women's suffrage, labour rights and other social movements had been planted, even if Victoria herself might have disapproved of where they would lead. And the Victorian Empire, at its peak when Victoria died, carried within it both the height of British global power and the beginnings of its decline. The colonial troops who had marched so proudly in the Diamond Jubilee procession represented nations that would eventually seek and win independence, transforming the empire into the Commonwealth. Perhaps Victoria's most lasting legacy was the monarchy itself. When she came to the throne in 1837, the reputation of the British monarchy had been damaged by the excesses and scandals of her predecessors. Through her long reign, Victoria restored public respect for the crown, establishing a model of constitutional monarchy focused on duty, family values, and symbolic national unity rather than direct political power. "The Queen is dead. Long live the King," proclaimed the heralds as Edward VII acceded to the throne. But in a very real sense, Victoria's influence never died. Today, we use Victorian as shorthand for an entire worldview, sometimes as a criticism. Victorian prudishness, Victorian hypocrisy, sometimes with nostalgia, Victorian craftsmanship, Victorian values. The term has become detached from the woman herself, referring instead to the era and attitudes associated with her reign. Yet behind these generalizations was a real person, a woman who became queen at 18, who loved deeply and grieved deeply, who witnessed more change than any previous monarch, who struggled with depression and duty and family conflicts, who made mistakes and showed prejudices common to her time, but who ultimately created a model of constitutional monarchy that continues to this day. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine London on that January day in 1901 as news of the Queen's death spread through the city, church bells tolled, theatres and shops closed, newspapers printed black-bordered special editions, people gathered in public squares, sharing memories and concerns about the future. "I was born in her first year on the throne," an elderly man tells a group of young factory workers. "Lived my whole life under Victoria. Can't quite believe she's gone." "What do you think the new king will be like?" asks one of the young men. "Different," the old man replies simply. "Times change, but what she built, that'll last." And he was right. The world Victoria shaped, industrialised, urbanised, global in outlook, is recognisably our own, despite the enormous changes of the 120-plus years since her death. When we look at Victorian photographs, the people seem distant and formal in their stiff poses and unfamiliar clothes. But when we read their letters, diaries and novels, their hopes, fears and feelings resonate across time. They worried about technology changing too fast. They debated the proper balance of work and family life. They struggled with ethical questions about wealth inequality. They celebrated achievements and mourned losses. They fell in love, raised children, pursued careers and sought meaning in their lives, just as we do. The Victorian era, for all its strangeness to modernise, was a pivotal moment in creating the world we inhabit, and at its centre was Victoria herself, not just a queen, but a woman whose life spanned one of the most transformative periods in human history, who grew from an inexperienced teenager to a global icon whose name became synonymous with an age. As you settle deeper into your comfortable, clean bed with electric lights you can switch off with a touch, perhaps take a moment to appreciate how many aspects of your daily life have roots in Victoria's time, from the books on your shelf to the pipes that bring water to your home.